Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, the place where bedtime stories come with the lingering scent of wood smoke, rancid butter, and the faint sound of someone swearing in Old Danish because the roast just fell into the ashes. Tonight, we're not sipping wine with kings or watching knights polish their honour. We're heading straight into the choking, blistering, utterly thankless world of a medieval Danish castle kitchen. Forget the romantic idea of a cook as some plump jolly figure stirring a pot while singing folk tunes. The truth was far less adorable and far more, well, let's call it scorched survival. You see, in a 14th century Danish castle, the cook wasn't just making dinner. They were feeding a fortress, keeping political alliances alive through feasts, and walking a fine line where one bad meal could cost you your job, or, if you were unlucky, your freedom. Because in a noble court, failure wasn't just a culinary disaster, it was an insult. And insults were dangerous. Chapter 1. Before dawn in the kitchen. The first thing you notice is the cold, not the crisp, refreshing sort, but the kind that creeps through stone walls and wraps around your bones. It's long before sunrise, and while the lord and lady of the castle still dream under heavy furs, the kitchen staff is already stumbling through the dark, clutching kindling, blowing on numb fingers, and trying not to trip over a half-asleep scullion who decided the floor by the ovens was the warmest bed in the castle. At the centre of it all is Mads, the head cook. Not because this is his story, no, we're not here for fairy tale character arcs, but because you'll see him again, barking orders, cursing over undercooked venison, and generally ensuring that everyone else's life is slightly more miserable than his own. Mads has been doing this job for 20 years, which in kitchen terms is basically like surviving 3 lifetimes. His hands are scarred, his voice is hoarse from shouting over roaring fires, and his sense of humour is so dry it could be used as kindling. The kitchen itself is a cavern, not the cosy heart of the home you might picture, but a vast, smoke-stained chamber with a central hearth big enough to roast an entire boar. The walls are blackened from years of soot. The air hangs heavy with the smells of old grease, yesterday's fish bones, and the faint tang of mould from barrels of grain that didn't quite make it through the winter. Fires aren't started fresh every day. That would waste precious flint. So the first job is to coax life back into last night's embers, blowing and feeding them until flames leap high enough to see your eyebrows if you lean too close. And here's the fun part. Medieval kitchens weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for output. Ventilation was more a suggestion than a reality. So by the time the fires are roaring, the air is thick enough to chew. Cooks and scullions work with streaming eyes, coughing between orders, and wiping sweat that's somehow managing to exist even when it's still freezing outside. In summer, it's worse. An inferno where the only air conditioning is stepping outside into the equally unpleasant smell of the castle latrines. Food preparation starts hours before anyone else eats. Bread must be baked in great dome-shaped ovens that take hours to heat properly. That means the bakers are already here, sweating in the glow of the ovens, shaping heavy loaves of rye and barley bread. A Danish noble might get wheat bread, the white fluffy kind, but that's reserved for the upper table. Everyone else? Dense, dark loaves that could double as blunt weapons in an emergency. The rest of the kitchen is a blur of activity. Salted herring is soaking in buckets to leach out some of the brine before it's cooked. Though cooked might be a generous term for what's about to happen to it. Root vegetables are hauled in from storage, turnips, onions, carrots, all stored in cool cellars since autumn. Pottage. The eternal medieval stew is already simmering, made from whatever's left over from yesterday, topped up with fresh water and left to bubble until it's ready, which is really just shorthand for safe enough to eat. Now, you might think cooks had it easy with such simple menus, but here's the kicker. In a Danish castle, the kitchen wasn't just feeding the lord and lady. On any given day, there might be dozens of guards, servants, clerks, and hangers-on, plus unexpected guests who had to be impressed. That meant variety was a constant demand, even in the dead of winter. And variety costs, not just in money, but in the sanity of the cook trying to make salted fish look appealing for the 4th time this week. And here's where the criticism comes in. Medieval nobility loved to talk about honour, piety, and frugality, but you wouldn't know it from their kitchens. Spices from as far away as India, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, were hoarded like treasure, not for health or taste, but to flaunt wealth. Dishes were overcomplicated for no reason, other than to remind guests that this castle had enough resources to waste them on gilded pastries, while the peasants outside lived on watery porridge. In fact, kitchens were a microcosm of medieval hypocrisy. Outside, the church preached about gluttony as a sin. Inside, the kitchens prepared feasts that would put a modern buffet to shame. And cooks like Mads knew the truth. These extravagances weren't about feeding people. They were about feeding egos. As the fires blaze hotter, and the smell of baking bread mingles with the faint stink of the pig offal that will be stewed for the lower ranks' supper, Mads surveys the room with the weary satisfaction of a man who knows the day will be long, hard, and full of complaints. But at least it will end with him alive, which is more than you can say for some unlucky cooks in history. By the time the first hint of dawn filters through the high, narrow windows, the kitchen is already a world unto itself, noisy, smoky, and relentless. And in this world, survival doesn't depend on chivalry or bravery. It depends on knowing exactly how long a piece of venison can roast without burning, and how to make sure your lord never tastes the difference between fresh and 3 days past its prime. By the time the castle stirs above, the kitchen is already deep into its grind. The scullions, those at the bottom of the kitchen's grim hierarchy, are hunched over wooden tubs, peeling onions with fingers red from cold water. Peeling onions in a medieval kitchen is not the tear-jerking inconvenience we think of today. It's a near-blinding task when done in a smoke-filled hall with no chimney strong enough to keep the air clear. The onion skins stick to damp fingers. The smell soaks into the skin, and no amount of scrubbing later will erase the faint stench of kitchen work. These young helpers, often just boys sent from peasant families, know better than to complain. Complaints have a way of earning more work, not less. Mads walks the kitchen floor like a general inspecting troops, barking orders in clipped guttural Danish. More wood on that spitfire, he snaps, because the haunch of venison turning on the iron rod is too close to the embers, threatening to dry into leather before the Lord's table ever sees it. He knows from experience that a single overdone joint of meat can be enough for a noble to declare a cook incompetent, a dangerous label in a world where dismissal doesn't come with a severance package, but with the sudden loss of your bed, food, and protection. In the more paranoid courts, a cook accused of intentional offence could even find themselves in the castle's damp, rat-infested dungeon. And if you think that's exaggeration, well, let's just say there are records of cooks being flogged for under-seasoning a dish served to a foreign ambassador. The great hearth dominates everything. At its centre, iron cauldrons bubble with the ever-present pottage, that eternal stew of vegetables, grains, and scraps of meat, ladled out to anyone who works in the castle but doesn't merit a seat at the high table. This pot is a living thing, never entirely emptied, always topped up with fresh ingredients when available and water when not. Theoretically, the constant boiling kills off anything that might make people sick. Theoretically. In reality, a pot of food that's been on the boil for weeks collects flavours and bacteria that no amount of herbs can disguise. The smell in the kitchen is a dense layering of the day's work. There's the earthy sweetness of roasting root vegetables, the fatty perfume of pork sizzling over flame, the briny sting of fish being gutted at the wooden tables, and underneath it all, the acrid tang of wood smoke that will cling to every stitch of clothing until the next washing, which, for a medieval cook, is a rare indulgence. The heavy wool garments absorb grease and soot like sponges, and since laundry means labour, you wear your stains like badges of experience. In summer, that means working through the day with a coat of sweat under a crust of dried kitchen grime. Romantic, isn't it? There is a rhythm to all this, but it's a rhythm powered by necessity, not choice. Every task is aimed at the unspoken deadline of the day's first meal. In a Danish castle of the 14th century, the first major meal, often called dinner, might be served as early as mid-morning, and everything must be ready to leave the kitchen hot, intact, and with the sort of presentation that says, "We are richer, more powerful, and more refined than our neighbours." This is why the cook's life is equal parts chef, craftsman, and stage magician. A meal isn't just sustenance, it's propaganda. served on a platter. That propaganda comes at a cost. To make dishes look exotic, cooks lean heavily on spices. Cinnamon, pepper, ginger, all absurdly expensive, arrive by ship from southern ports, their long journeys paid for in coin that could feed dozens of peasants for a year. But instead of nourishing the hungry, they'll be sprinkled into a lord's pie, not for taste, but for the spectacle of wealth. This is the contradiction of the medieval kitchen. It sits at the intersection of survival and excess, feeding both the needy and the already overfed, but never in equal measure. Then there's the meat, and here's where the reality gets a bit darker. Fresh meat in a castle wasn't always fresh in the way we understand it today. Without modern refrigeration, the gap between slaughter and rot was painfully short, especially in summer. Meat was preserved in salt, smoked until nearly inedible, or cooked quickly before decay set in. Sometimes it arrived in the kitchen already smelling off, strong spices, heavy sauces, and plenty of wine to mask the truth. The rich could pretend it was part of the recipe, the poor knew it was a gamble. While Mads oversees the work, his most trusted helper, a wiry, sharp-eyed woman named Ellen, tends to the bread. She knows exactly how long the ovens take to cool from roaring hot to baking temperature, and she works by instinct, not measurement. In another world, she might have run her own shop, but here her skill is locked inside castle walls, feeding the same privileged few every day. She is respected in the kitchen, but invisible to the feast. Nobles do not thank their cooks. They assume good food is their right. By the time the castle bell tolls to announce the coming day, the kitchen is already slick with activity. Sweat runs in rivulets down backs, wood chips cling to damp hands, and every surface, from the chopping boards to the floor, bears some evidence of the chaos. A dog hovers near the door, knowing that scraps will eventually be thrown out, and the kitchen boys shoo it away without success. The air is loud with the crackle of fire, the thunk of knives, the murmur of orders passed between workers, and the occasional hiss when fat drips into the flames. There's no pause for reflection. The medieval kitchen moves in cycles: preparation, cooking, serving, cleaning, and then starting over. Every day is a race against time, spoilage, and the volatile moods of those upstairs. Cooks live in the tension between pride in their craft and the knowledge that their craft is never truly theirs. And as the first dishes leave the kitchen, borne upstairs by servants with instructions not to spill so much as a drop, Mads leans briefly against the hearth wall, catching his breath. He doesn't smile. That would imply the day is done. It's only just begun. Chapter 2. The Castle's Demands. If the kitchen before dawn was a world of smoke and sweat, then the hours that followed were the crucible in which every cook's sanity was tested. Feeding a Danish castle wasn't just about cooking meals. It was about maintaining the illusion that the lord and lady presided over a realm of endless abundance. In reality, abundance was seasonal, fragile, and bought at the expense of someone else's hunger. The cook's job was to make scarcity look like opulence, to transform whatever the pantry held into dishes that could impress guests, intimidate rivals, and keep the household staff from open revolt. A Danish noble's household in the 14th century was a sprawling, ever-changing beast. On any given day, the number of mouths to feed could double without warning. Messages arrived unannounced. Noble cousins appeared with retinues in tow. Priests came for consultations. And, of course, there was the constant presence of the garrison. These guests weren't fed in some separate, humbler hall. At least, not if they mattered politically. They were brought to the great table, which meant the kitchen had to stretch its resources without ever letting it show. To admit to running short on anything was to admit to weakness. And in a feudal society built on the perception of power, weakness was a luxury no noble could afford. That's why the kitchen operated under a constant low-level panic. It wasn't the sort of panic that made people run around screaming. It was the kind that had everyone working faster, speaking sharper, and glancing at the door every time a servant from the upper floors appeared with just one more request from above. Mads had learned long ago that nobles didn't ask if the kitchen could provide something. They simply assumed it could. If the pantry was bare of fresh fowl, you were expected to make salted goose taste like it had flown in that morning. If the root cellar's contents were shriveled and sprouting, you boiled them into oblivion with enough herbs to hide the truth. This constant demand for excellence was more than vanity. It was a political tool. Feasts were staged productions, each course a scene in a play meant to convey status. Serving a massive joint of beef when everyone else's lord could only offer rabbit wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a declaration of superiority, and when foreign envoys visited, the menu became a diplomatic weapon. A badly timed or poorly presented dish could be read as an insult, whether intentional or not. The cook had to be a master of politics as well as the kitchen, even if no one outside those stone walls ever knew his name. The strain of this was visible in the way the kitchen was organized. There were no idle hands here. The youngest scullions hauled water from the well, a back-breaking and endless task in a building where every bucket had to be carried up or down stone stairs. Older assistants tended the spits, turning meat slowly for hours so it cooked evenly, a job that numbed the arms and roasted the face in equal measure. Ellen supervised the bread ovens, timing each batch so the loaves emerged perfectly browned, the crusts crackling, and Mads drifted between them all, inspecting, correcting, and occasionally snarling when something threatened to slip out of alignment. The great hall upstairs was the final stage, but the kitchen never saw the applause. Once the food left their hands, it became part of the noble performance. Silver platters gleamed under candlelight, wines were poured into goblets, and the Lord's guests ate as though the food had appeared by magic. No one mentioned the hands that had plucked the feathers from the swan, scrubbed the soot from the pans, or sweated in the heat to keep a sauce from curdling. Recognition was not part of the arrangement. If you did your job perfectly, you were invisible. If you failed, you were unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. This invisibility was both a shield and a curse. It meant that Mads could survive the court's political tempests by keeping his head down, focusing on his craft. But it also meant that he bore the brunt of every unrealistic expectation without ever sharing in the glory. The irony wasn't lost on him. He knew that while the Lord's guests marveled at a dish fit for a king, the pigs in the castle yard often ate better than the peasants beyond the walls. The kitchen was where these contradictions collided, where luxury existed alongside waste, and where food was a showpiece for power rather than a shared human need. It was also a place where danger came from more than just the fires and blades. A spoiled dish could sicken a guest, and in a world where medicine was as much superstition as science, suspicion often landed on the cook. A single outbreak of illness after a feast could ruin a career or end a life, regardless of whether the cook was truly to blame. In an age when poison was a legitimate political tool, every plate carried upstairs was a test of trust. Some lords even had official tasters, unfortunate souls who sampled each dish before it reached the table in case an enemy had slipped something lethal into the stew. And so, every day was a balancing act. The kitchen had to meet impossible demands without the benefit of modern tools, refrigeration, or consistent supplies. They relied on smokehouses, pickling vats, salting barrels, and the occasional miracle of a fresh kill or a successful fishing trip. They had to make it look easy, even when every choice was a gamble between pleasing the nobles and keeping the household fed. By midday, the first meal of the day was over, and the great hall buzzed with conversation. Deals struck over venison pies and sweet-spiced wine. Down in the kitchen, the staff were already thinking ahead to the evening feast. There was no rest, no moment to savour their own work. Plates returned to be scraped, pans were scrubbed in cold water, and new fires were stoked. The castle's demands never stopped, and neither did the kitchen. It was a relentless engine, powered by the labour of people whose names would never be remembered, in service to a po-by. The time the first plates from the morning meal returned to the kitchen, the next round of demands had already arrived. The steward appeared in the doorway, a man with the permanent expression of someone who has just tasted something sour. He read off the evening's requirements, in a tone that suggested these were minor, reasonable requests. A roast swan, for presentation, fresh fish, if possible, and a display of sugared fruits to remind the visiting bishop of the Lord's wealth. Each request landed like a brick in Mad's mind. Swan meant an entire day of preparation. Fish meant bargaining with the castle's fishermen and hoping the ice on the river hadn't made the catch impossible. And sugared fruit meant hours over a pot of imported sugar that cost more than most of the kitchen staff would see in a year. In truth, these weren't requests. They were orders, issued with the assumption that the kitchen could bend reality to fit the occasion. That assumption wasn't entirely wrong. The staff had become experts at creating the illusion of abundance. A smaller swan could be padded out with roasted capons arranged artfully around it. If the fish were scarce, preserved ones could be rehydrated, dressed in herbs, and served in a way that suggested freshness. And if the fruit wasn't ripe or in season, the kitchen could use honey glazes and careful presentation to disguise the truth. This was culinary theatre, and everyone in the kitchen knew their lines. The pressure wasn't just about satisfying noble palates. Feasts were public spectacles within the castle, and word of them travelled beyond the walls. The merchants who supplied spices, wine, and rare ingredients wanted their goods displayed prominently. Visiting envoys would report back to their courts not only on the Lord's military strength, but also on his hospitality. Even the servants took mental notes, whispering about the quality of the bread or the richness of the meat, gossip that could make its way back to those in power. In this way, the kitchen's work rippled outward, affecting reputations and alliances in ways no one outside its smoke-stained walls might guess. The result was a level of constant vigilance that bordered on paranoia. Mads inspected every dish before it left the kitchen, tasting sauces, checking for grit in the bread, running his thumb along the edge of a roast to see if the meat was still pink. He had learned the hard way that the smallest flaw could be seized upon as evidence of incompetence. Nobles had long memories for slights, and something as minor as a tough slice of beef could be remembered for years. A whispered anecdote at another lord's table, retold with increasing embellishment until the cook's name became shorthand for failure. And yet, for all the control he tried to exert, so much depended on forces beyond the kitchen's reach. The quality of the grain from the last harvest, the number of pigs slaughtered before winter, the availability of fresh herbs in the garden, all these things could swing wildly from one season to the next. A wet summer could ruin the barley crop, a hard winter could freeze the river solid and halt fishing for weeks. When shortages hit, the cook's skill lay not in creating luxury, but in concealing deprivation. A watery stew could be thickened with breadcrumbs to give the illusion of richness. A tough joint of mutton could be slow-cooked until it fell apart, hiding the fact that it was from an animal long past its prime. For the lower ranks of the household, these tricks were less about illusion and more about survival. The servants' hall didn't see sugared fruit or delicate pastries. They ate what was left after the nobility had their fill. Bones were boiled twice for stock, bread crusts were softened in broth, and offal, the hearts, livers and kidneys that the upper tables turned their noses at, became the core of the meal. It was filling, if not exactly appetizing, and it kept the workforce alive enough to keep serving. This too was part of the castle's demands, to feed the many without taking away from the few who mattered. The political nature of food meant that even the act of sourcing ingredients was fraught. The castle's steward might strike a deal with a local fisherman one week and threaten him the next if prices rose too high. Farmers delivering grain might have part of their payment withheld until they agreed to send the better portion to the lord's stores. To the peasants, the castle's kitchen was a hungry, unyielding mouth, always demanding more and giving little in return. That resentment simmered beyond the walls, but it rarely reached those at the top, protected as they were by a buffer of servants, retainers and stone. Within the kitchen, resentment took a different form. Cooks grumbled about the hypocrisy of a lord who preached charity from the chapel, but scolded them for serving a pie that wasn't sufficiently gilded. They joked, in the bitter way overworked people do, that the Lord's appetite for glory was larger than his appetite for food. And yet, no one dared say these things too loudly. Sarcasm might be tolerated among the kitchen staff, but if the wrong words reached the wrong ears, a cook could find himself working elsewhere, and elsewhere, often meant far less secure employment than a castle post. By late afternoon, preparations for the evening feast would be well underway. The air in the kitchen grew heavier with the mingling smells of roasting meat, baking bread, and spiced wine simmering in a great copper pot. The floor became slick with drippings and spilled ale, and the noise swelled to a steady roar. The pace was relentless, because the feast could not be delayed. In the rigid world of noble etiquette, food arrived when it was meant to arrive, no sooner, no later, and any deviation could be read as a failure in discipline. As the first platters began their journey upstairs, the kitchen braced for the inevitable last-minute requests. A noblewoman might decide she wanted a dish that wasn't on the menu. A guest might demand more wine than had been set aside. These were not politely declined. The kitchen's role was to make the impossible happen, and to make it look effortless. That was, after all, what the castle demanded. Not just sustenance, but spectacle, no matter the cost to those who made it happen. Were that could never be satisfied. Chapter 3. Ingredients from near and far. If the kitchen's labour was the heart of the castle, its ingredients were the lifeblood, and like any lifeblood, they had to be drawn from somewhere. In a medieval Danish castle, the somewhere could mean as close as the castle garden or as far as the ports of the Mediterranean, with a long, treacherous supply chain in between. The variety might sound impressive until you realize how much of it was dictated not by culinary imagination, but by necessity, availability, and the occasional burst of arrogance from the upper floors. The most dependable ingredients came from the castle's own demesne, the lands directly under the lord's control. Grain was the cornerstone, rye and barley for bread, oats for porridge, sometimes wheat if the soil and climate were forgiving enough, though wheat was a temperamental crop in Danish winters. These grains were milled in the lord's mill, baked in the castle ovens, and distributed in proportions that mirrored the social hierarchy. Nobles got the finer, lighter bread. Everyone else chewed their way through darker, denser loaves that could last a week without moulding, which was another way of saying they could survive a week without anyone daring to eat them unless they had to. Then there were the vegetables, hardy, unglamorous, and stubborn in their survival. Turnips, leeks, onions, and cabbages made up the bulk of the kitchen's plant life. In the warmer months, fresh herbs like parsley, dill, and lovage brightened the dishes, though by brightened, we mean they took the edge off the saltiness of preserved meat. Root vegetables stored well, which was fortunate because the garden's green bounty didn't last long once frost set in. By midwinter, the kitchen's idea of fresh was anything that wasn't sprouting white mold or crawling with something uninvited. Meat was both a staple and a challenge. Fresh kills were a luxury in winter, when hunting was more about sport for the nobility than a steady source of protein for the kitchen. Pork was the most common, as pigs could be fattened quickly and slaughtered before the coldest months. Cows were too valuable for milk and labour to slaughter often, so beef was less common. Poultry, chickens, ducks, geese, filled in the gaps, though they were eaten sparingly compared to how often their eggs were used. Fish, on the other hand, was abundant but rarely inspiring. Herring from the coast, pike from nearby rivers, eels that could be trapped in weirs. Fresh fish was a treat, salted fish was a constant. The kitchen worked miracles trying to make the latter edible, soaking it for hours, simmering it with herbs, and praying the nobles wouldn't notice its rubbery texture. And then there were the exotic imports, the glittering trophies of medieval trade. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, pepper, and cloves travelled thousands of miles, carried by merchants who risked storms, piracy, and corrupt customs officials. These were not everyday ingredients. They were culinary currency, displayed as proof of the lord's wealth and connections. A single ounce of pepper could cost a labourer's monthly wage. When Mads reached for the spice chest, it wasn't with casual ease, but with the wary reverence of someone handling royal jewels. One wrong move, one over-generous pinch, could cost him dearly. Sugar was another import, rarer still and more expensive than honey. When it arrived in the castle stores, it came in hard, conical loaves that had to be broken with a hammer before being ground fine. It was used sparingly, mostly in medicines or showpiece desserts. The nobles loved it not because it was sweet, but because it was rare. Serving it was less about flavour and more about making guests gasp at the extravagance. Meanwhile, the servants sweetened their occasional treats with honey, which, while more common, was still valuable enough to be guarded carefully. Salt, though not exotic, was as precious as any spice. Without it, preservation was impossible. Meat was salted in great barrels until it hardened into something that could survive months without spoiling. Fish was packed in salt so heavily that it had to be soaked for a full day before cooking. The castle's salt came from coastal evaporation ponds or distant mines, and it was guarded fiercely. Losing a barrel of salt to damp or theft was not just a loss of seasoning, it was a loss of security for the coming months. Sourcing all this was its own ordeal. The castle's reeve, part tax collector, part logistics officer, ensured that tithes and rents were collected in kind as often as in coin. Peasants brought their dues in grain, eggs, butter, and livestock, much of which went straight to the castle kitchen. What didn't come from tenants had to be purchased from markets or travelling merchants, and those transactions were delicate dances of negotiation and intimidation. The kitchen's needs were non-negotiable, the means of meeting them were anything but. The gulf between what the nobility demanded and what the land provided was bridged by ingenuity and, occasionally, deception. Mads knew a dozen ways to stretch expensive ingredients, like mixing less costly spices into pepper to make it last, or using almond milk in place of dairy when fresh milk was scarce. Nobles preferred to think their dishes were made entirely from the finest imports. They rarely asked how the kitchen achieved the desired flavour. That suited Mads fine. The less the upper tables knew about the sleight of hand involved, the better for everyone. This was the paradox of ingredients in a medieval Danish castle. The kitchen had access to both the humblest and the most extravagant foods, yet it was constantly at the mercy of shortages, spoilage, and the whims of the weather. The garden could flourish one year and fail the next. A shipment of pepper could arrive on time or be lost to a storm. Mads and his crew learned to navigate these fluctuations, the way sailors navigated shifting seas, with caution, adaptability, and a healthy dose of cynicism. After all, the guests upstairs might marvel at the variety before them, but the kitchen knew the truth. Variety was not a given. It was a battle fought daily, one not with abundance, but with the illusion of it. If you've ever opened your kitchen cupboard and sighed because you're missing one spice for a recipe, imagine trying to feed a medieval castle without a reliable supply chain, refrigeration, or even the guarantee that your goods wouldn't arrive mouldy, infested, or stolen. For cooks like Mads, ingredients weren't just items on a shelf. They were trophies wrestled from the jaws of scarcity, time, and human greed, and each one came with a backstory. Take pepper, for instance. Today, it's so common it sits on every restaurant table in a cheap grinder. In the 14th century, pepper was an international status symbol. It travelled from India's Malabar coast, across the Arabian Sea, through the bustling ports of the Levant, and into the hands of Venetian merchants who controlled much of Europe's spice trade. From there, it wound its way through the Baltic trade routes of the Hanseatic League before finally reaching Danish shores. By the time it landed in the castle's kitchen, its cost had multiplied tenfold, each middleman adding his profit. That tiny pinch on a lord's roasted beef was, quite literally, a display of global commerce on a plate. Then there were the more fragile imports, like ginger and cloves, which had to survive long journeys without losing their potency. These were stored in tightly sealed chests, wrapped in waxed cloth to keep out damp, and rationed with almost obsessive care. A single spill or infestation of spice beetles could wipe out a year's worth of flavouring, and with it, the cook's ability to dazzle the upper tables. Mads guarded the spice cupboard like a fortress within a fortress, knowing full well that even the most loyal kitchen boy could be tempted to pinch a bit for trade on the side. Closer to home, trade still shaped the kitchen's inventory. Salted herring, the backbone of northern European fasting diets, arrived in vast barrels from coastal towns like Skåne, where whole industries revolved around salting, packing, and shipping the fish before it spoiled. This wasn't just food, it was economics. Herring was so valuable that kings taxed it, wars were fought over fishing rights, and entire markets rose and fell with the season's catch. A poor fishing year could raise prices so high that even the castle had to ration its stores, while a glut meant the lower servants might enjoy fish more than once in a week. Preservation was not just practical, but essential. Without modern refrigeration, food had to be stabilized against decay in whatever way the climate allowed. Meat was salted, smoked, or packed in fat to keep out air and moisture. Fish could be dried hard as wood, meant to be rehydrated in cooking. Vegetables were pickled in brine or vinegar, sometimes more for the illusion of freshness than for taste. In winter, ice and snow became natural cold storage, but a sudden thaw could spell disaster, turning stored meat into a dangerous gamble. Seasonality was the tyrant that ruled them all. In summer, the castle might enjoy a burst of fresh greens, berries, and herbs, but these were fleeting luxuries. Autumn was the season of slaughter, when animals were killed and preserved for the winter months. Spring was often the leanest time of all, when stored food was running low, the last barrels of salted meat were going grey around the edges, and fresh crops had yet to mature. This hungry gap could be just as dangerous for a castle as it was for a peasant village, though the difference was that nobles had the wealth to buy their way out of famine by importing supplies, even if it meant draining the treasury. But here's where the political dimension crept in. Every shipment that arrived at the castle, whether it was a cart of barley from a tenant farm or a barrel of wine from Lübeck, was a visible sign of the lord's reach and authority. Food was as much a symbol of power as the castle walls themselves. The ability to serve rare dishes in midwinter was proof that the lord's influence extended beyond his own lands. In this sense, the cook became a silent participant in the theatre of rulership, arranging the edible evidence of dominance on silver platters. And yet, the kitchen's reality was often far from the grandeur it projected. Imported goods could be adulterated. Spices were sometimes mixed with cheaper fillers like ground nutshells or sawdust. Sugar could be cut with chalk, and wine could sour on the journey north. Mads had to be part cook, part inspector, sniffing out fraud before it reached the high table. Failure to catch it could mean humiliation or accusations of sabotage. Even local produce was not without its risks. Grain could be tainted with ergot, a fungus that caused convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. Freshwater fish from the moat or nearby rivers could carry parasites. Milk could sour in hours, turning precious butter into a useless mess if not churned in time. The castle kitchen was a place of constant triage, where every ingredient had to be assessed not just for taste, but for survival. In quieter moments, which were rare, Mads might think about how absurd it was that so much of his day revolved around making the impossible possible. He had, on more than one occasion, been asked to produce fresh strawberries in December or to serve a dish as they eat it in Paris, despite never having set foot outside Denmark. These demands weren't just whimsical, they were deliberate displays of superiority, ways for the nobility to show that they could command seasons and distances alike. Mads knew the truth. He wasn't bending nature to his will, he was bending himself to theirs. The paradox of ingredients in the medieval Danish castle was that the kitchen had both too much and never enough. Too much in the sense that it had access to luxuries unimaginable to most people of the age. Never enough in that there was always another feast, another visiting dignitary, another chance to outshine the neighbouring lord. Every exotic spice, every barrel of salted fish, every sack of grain carried with it a weight of expectation, and the unspoken threat of what would happen if those expectations weren't met. Chapter 4. The Heat and the Danger. If you want to understand why cooks in medieval Danish castles rarely grew old in their profession, you have to start with the heat. This wasn't the gentle warmth of a cozy hearth. It was an oppressive, airless inferno, the kind that made your skin prickle before the day even began. The main kitchen hearths were designed for maximum output, not comfort. Open flames leapt high, spits groaned under the weight of whole animals, and iron cauldrons large enough to bathe a child boiled constantly, their steam mixing with the smoke in a choking haze. Without chimneys capable of carrying away all that heat, much of it stayed trapped in the room, along with soot that coated walls, rafters, and lungs alike. Working near those fires for hours was more than uncomfortable. It was dangerous. The risk of burns was constant, and came in every size, from the casual singe of a hairline to blisters that made it hard to grip a knife. Scullions turning spits had to sit or stand close enough to keep the meat evenly roasted, but not so close that their skin cooked faster than the food. Even with careful attention, fat dripping into the flames could cause sudden flare-ups that scorched faces or forearms. In an era without first aid beyond herbal poultices and prayers, a bad burn could fester into a lethal infection. Then there was the smoke, a slow, invisible killer. Day after day of breathing in wood smoke and soot blackened the lungs, leading to a persistent cough that most cooks carried like part of their uniform. Historical accounts from across Europe describe kitchen workers spitting black phlegm and suffering from chronic wheezing, what we might now call occupational lung disease. No one in the 14th century knew the term carbon monoxide poisoning, but fainting near a badly vented fire was a common enough occurrence to be considered part of the job. Fire wasn't the only hazard. The medieval kitchen was a jungle of sharp edges and heavy tools. Cleavers, long knives, meat hooks, all forged thick and meant to last, were as likely to maim the cook as the carcass. Dropping a knife into a crowded space risked more than a cut. It could take off a finger before anyone had time to swear. Mads had a scar along his left hand from a slip while butchering a pig in his first year at the castle. The fact that he still had the hand at all was, in his view, a mark of experience. The floor added its own dangers. Spilled fat, water, and vegetable peelings made the flagstones slick, and with workers constantly moving heavy pots and plates, a fall could mean more than bruises. A dropped cauldron of boiling stew didn't just ruin dinner. It could send someone to the infirmary for weeks. And while the castle might spare a servant's life, it wouldn't spare their position. In the feudal economy, an injured worker was a liability, and there was always another hungry body waiting to take their place. The noise was another constant strain, a danger of a different sort. The kitchen never stopped clanging, hissing, shouting. Communication had to be loud to cut through the roar of the hearths and the thump of cleavers on wooden blocks. It meant working in an environment where you were always half yelling, half listening, your head ringing long after the day was done. And yet, in the chaos, the expectation was absolute precision. A mistake in timing, seasoning, or presentation could bring more heat than the fire ever could. The verbal lashing from the steward, or, worse, the Lord himself. One of the lesser-known hazards was the sheer weight of the work. Meat was roasted in pieces so large they needed 2 people to carry. Barrels of ale had to be rolled and hoisted into place. Sacks of flour weighed as much as a small person. Strain injuries were inevitable, and without the concept of light duty, you either kept working through the pain or found yourself without a roof over your head. The kitchen was no place for the weak or the careless, and the attrition rate among younger staff was high. There were also the hazards no one liked to speak about openly, the ones tied to suspicion and superstition. Kitchens were frequent suspects in cases of poisoning, whether real or imagined. A sudden illness after a feast could see the cook interrogated, sometimes brutally, to prove their innocence. Even an accident could be twisted into a political weapon. If a visiting noble broke a tooth on a stray bone, it could be spun as an insult. In such a charged environment, the kitchen had to be as much a political safe zone as a workspace, a place where nothing could be traced back as an intentional slight. And of course, there were the pests. Rats, mice, and insects were constant companions, drawn to the heat and the food. Cats were kept in the kitchen to hunt rodents, but their presence came with its own risks. A startled cat knocking over a bowl of cream could undo hours of work. Mads considered the cats part of the staff, but he also knew they could never truly keep the vermin at bay. Rodent droppings in the grain or gnawed sacks of flour were a fact of life. One more reason for thorough inspection before anything reached the cooking fire. Perhaps the greatest danger, though, was the unrelenting pace. Fatigue dulls the senses, makes hands clumsy and minds slow. In a place where a single slip could mean serious injury, tiredness was as dangerous as any knife. Yet rest was a luxury the kitchen couldn't afford. With meals for the nobility, the garrison, the servants, and the occasional unannounced guest, there was always another pot to stir, another roast to turn, another tray to prepare. And when the day's cooking ended, the cleaning began, followed by the endless work of preparing for tomorrow. By the end of a long day, the heat in the kitchen wasn't just physical, it was mental. The constant pressure to perform under dangerous conditions wore on everyone, from the spick boys to the head cook. Mads sometimes wondered if the castle's lords had any idea of the toll their feasts took on the people who made them possible. He suspected they did, and simply didn't care. After all, in their eyes, the kitchen's purpose wasn't to be safe. It was to be productive, spectacular, and invisible, no matter the cost to the people inside it. By late afternoon, the kitchen was at full boil, figuratively and literally. The hearths blazed, spits turned steadily, and the air shimmered with heat. This was the hour when the dangers multiplied. With every surface crowded and every pair of hands occupied, there was no room for hesitation. A scullion carrying a tray of pastries had to dodge between two workers hauling a cauldron of boiling broth, the steam rising in clouds that blurred vision and slicked the flagstones. If one person misjudged their step, the result could be injury, ruined food, and a wrathful head cook who had no patience for clumsiness. Fires in medieval kitchens were not gentle affairs. They were built to burn hot and long, consuming logs as thick as a man's arm. Without the modern luxury of thermostats or gas burners, controlling heat was a matter of instinct and constant attention. Too much fuel, and the flames roared high enough to scorch meat to cinders. Too little, and a carefully timed roast turned into a tough, unappetizing slab. In castles, where meals were expected to arrive precisely on schedule, the fire's mood could make or break a feast. Yet those same roaring flames could leap unpredictably if fat dripped too quickly or a log shifted suddenly, throwing sparks across the room. A single spark in the wrong place, say, onto a sack of flour or a pile of straw kindling, could turn a kitchen into an inferno. And unlike today, there were no fire brigades to call. The only firefighting tools were buckets of water, sand, or whatever quick thinking the staff could muster. Accidental fires were not rare in the medieval world, and kitchens were often the culprit. In towns and cities, whole streets had been lost to blazes that began when a cook left a pot unattended. Inside castles, the thick stone walls kept the flames contained more effectively, but that didn't mean the kitchen staff felt safe. Roof timbers could still catch, and once they did, the smoke would fill the corridors before anyone upstairs realized the danger. Stories from the period tell of kitchens being rebuilt after catastrophic burns, sometimes forcing the entire household to live on cold food for weeks while repairs were made. But the slow-burning dangers were perhaps more insidious. Prolonged exposure to the heat and smoke of the kitchen had a way of wearing people down long before their time. Chronic respiratory problems were almost a given. Medical texts from the late Middle Ages mention the cook's cough, a deep hacking condition likely caused by inhaling smoke, ash, and fine particles from grinding flour and spices. Add to this the constant strain on muscles from lifting heavy pots and bending over fires, and it was rare for a cook to reach old age without some permanent injury. Arthritis, back problems, and reduced lung capacity were as much part of the trade as knives and ladles. Burn injuries were common enough to be considered part of training. Younger workers quickly learned to keep their arms covered when stirring pots and to angle their faces away from steam. But no amount of caution could prevent every mishap. A single splash of hot oil could send someone staggering back in agony, and with no antiseptics, infections set in easily. Severe burns were sometimes treated with honey or vinegar poultices. remedies that provided some relief but rarely prevented scarring. In worse cases, infection could spread, and without modern medicine, even a minor kitchen accident could become fatal. Knives, cleavers, and axes carried their own risks. Butchery was done in bulk, and speed mattered. A half-frozen haunch of venison might need to be hacked apart before it could be cooked, and the tools used were heavy enough to cause real damage if they slipped. Amputations, while rare, were not unheard of. In a grim twist of practicality, some injured workers were simply reassigned to lighter duties, like herb chopping or dishwashing, not out of kindness, but because the kitchen couldn't afford to waste a body that still had two working hands. The physical space of the kitchen also played its part in making it a hazard zone. Many castle kitchens were built as separate structures, or at least partially detached from the main hall, to reduce fire risk. But that meant workers often had to carry heavy dishes outside, across courtyards, and up staircases, all while dodging servants, animals, and the occasional wandering noble. In bad weather, slippery stone steps added to the danger. A dropped platter was bad enough. A dropped platter while carrying it in front of the Lord's honoured guest could be a career-ending embarrassment. And then there were the less obvious dangers, like the water supply. Most kitchens drew water from wells or nearby streams, but these were often shared with other castle functions, including livestock pens and latrines. Contaminated water was a silent killer, capable of spreading dysentery or other illnesses through the household. Boiling helped, but not everything was cooked, and hand-washing wasn't the ingrained habit it is today. The kitchen could easily become the source of an outbreak, and the blame would fall on those who prepared the food, not those who supplied the water. For all these risks, there was little formal training in safety. Knowledge was passed from senior workers to juniors, often in the form of blunt warnings. Don't stand there unless you want to lose an eyebrow, or keep your thumb tucked or you'll lose it. Survival depended on developing a kind of sixth sense, knowing when a pot was about to boil over, when a fire was about to flare, or when someone behind you was carrying something heavy and hot. Mads had that sense after decades in the kitchen, and it had saved him more than once. Yet even with all his experience, he knew he could not control every variable. A noble's whim might require a change in menu halfway through cooking, forcing the kitchen into frantic rearrangements that doubled the risk of mistakes. A sudden delivery of game might mean butchering in haste, with knives flashing faster than safety allowed. And sometimes, bad luck simply struck. A spoon handle broke, sending soup spilling into the fire. A cat leapt onto a table and sent a pie crashing to the floor. A log shifted in the hearth and rolled out onto the rush-covered floor. In each case, the danger was real, the margin for error slim, and the consequences potentially catastrophic. The irony was that while the kitchen was one of the most dangerous places in the castle, it was also one of the least acknowledged. Guests saw only the polished results, the steaming platters, the golden crusts, the delicate sauces. They never saw the burns, the cuts, the coughs, or the sweat-soaked clothes, and if they did, they would probably wave it off as the cost of good service. Mads sometimes wondered whether the nobility would value their food more if they understood the dangers involved in making it. But then he remembered who he was working for. People who thought risking your life for a perfect roast was simply part of your job description. Chapter 5. The Hierarchy of the Kitchen. In the great social pyramid of a medieval Danish castle, the kitchen had its own miniature version, a carefully layered hierarchy where rank determined everything from what you cooked to whose orders you could safely ignore. For the untrained eye, it might look like a chaotic mass of people shouting, chopping, and hauling, but to anyone who worked there, it was as regimented as the garrison outside. In fact, the kitchen was run more like a military unit than a household room. At the top of this greasy command chain stood the head cook, and in this castle, that was Mads. His authority was absolute, at least within the kitchen's walls, and his word could override even the steward's if it concerned matters of timing, preparation, or presentation. He was responsible not just for cooking, but for planning menus, managing supplies, and ensuring that the Lord's table never suffered embarrassment. His position was precarious, though. A series of excellent feasts could make him indispensable. One poorly received banquet could see him demoted to stirring porridge for the servants. The head cook's role demanded not only culinary skill, but political awareness. Knowing which noble preferred venison over beef, which guest disliked garlic, and which feast needed to be so impressive, it was still talked about 3 winters later. Directly beneath Mads were the assistant cooks, often older, trusted hands, who could take charge of specific sections of the kitchen. One might oversee roasting, another baking, another the stews and sauces. They were the backbone of production, capable of stepping in if Mads was called away or overwhelmed. In smaller matters, a single assistant might handle everything, but in a castle of this size, specialization was the key to efficiency. These assistants were also the ones who trained the younger staff, not out of kindness, but because an untrained scullion could ruin a dish and bring down everyone's hard work. Then came the spit boys, usually young boys or teenagers tasked with the mind-numbing labor of turning roasting spits by hand for hours. This wasn't just busy work. An uneven turn could result in meat that was burnt on one side and raw on the other. In wealthier kitchens, mechanical spit jacks powered by weights or even trained dogs walking in wheels replaced some of this labor. But in many places, it was still done the hard way, by a bored, sweating boy who had to resist the temptation to nap. The position was low in status, but important enough that mistakes could lead to a beating or dismissal. The scullions formed the bulk of the kitchen's workforce. They cleaned pots, scrubbed floors, hauled water, disposed of waste, and prepared ingredients, peeling vegetables, plucking poultry, gutting fish. Their work was dirty, exhausting, and endless, but it was also the starting point for anyone hoping to rise in the kitchen ranks. Advancement was slow and depended on proving you could follow orders, endure long hours, and keep your head down when tempers flared. In a profession where turnover was high due to injuries, illness, or sheer exhaustion, a scullion who lasted more than a few years was often promoted out of sheer necessity. Outside the direct cooking staff, there were specialist roles. The pantryman managed bread, cheese, and cold meats, ensuring these staples were ready for both the high table and the servants' hall. The butler, from the old French boutellier, handled the wine and ale, keeping the casks in order and ensuring the lord's goblet was never empty. The larderer oversaw the storage and preservation of meat, a role requiring both trust and skill. A spoiled joint could ruin a meal, but theft from the larder was a constant temptation. In some households, the pastry cook was a separate specialist, skilled in making the elaborate pies and tarts that nobles loved to show off at feasts. The kitchen's hierarchy didn't just determine who did what, it dictated the flow of authority and blame. Orders moved downward, responsibility moved upward. If a scullion burned the bread, the assistant baker was at fault for not supervising. If the assistant baker failed, Mads took the heat, sometimes literally, if the lord decided to make his displeasure public. This chain of accountability kept discipline tight, but it also bred resentment. Lower-ranking workers knew they would be the first to take punishment and the last to receive credit. Discipline in the kitchen was swift and physical. In an age when corporal punishment was normal, a cuff to the head or a sharp slap with a wooden spoon was considered a mild correction. More serious mistakes could result in being struck with the flat of a cleaver, locked out of the kitchen in the cold, or forced to perform unpleasant duties like cleaning the grease traps or emptying chamber pots from the servants' quarters. Repeated failure could mean dismissal, and for a servant with no family connections or savings, that could be a death sentence in the wider medieval world. Rank also determined access to food. The head cook and senior assistants often sampled dishes as they prepared them, partly for quality control, and partly because it was one of the few perks of the job. Spit boys and scullions ate later, usually from the servants' pottage or whatever scraps were left from the high table. This system ensured that those with the most skill and responsibility stayed well fed enough to keep working, and that those at the bottom had incentive to work their way up. The kitchen hierarchy mirrored the feudal system outside its doors, with loyalty and service flowing upward and protection flowing downward, at least in theory. In practice, protection was minimal, and loyalty was often more about survival than genuine respect. Mads was respected because he knew his craft and could shield his staff from the worst of the steward's wrath. In other castles, head cooks were feared, ruling with the same arbitrary cruelty as a petty lord. Interestingly, the hierarchy also served as a training system. Many cooks who started in castle kitchens went on to work in other noble households, monasteries, or wealthy merchant homes, carrying with them the techniques and recipes they had learned. This made the kitchen not just a workplace, but a kind of culinary school, albeit one where the tuition was paid in sweat, burns, and long hours. Above all, the hierarchy ensured that the kitchen functioned as a well-drilled machine. In a place where dozens or even hundreds of people might need feeding in a single day, there was no room for disorder. Everyone knew their place, their task, and their limits, and while the nobility might never think twice about the people who made their meals possible, the kitchen staff knew better. Without their tightly run chain of command, the grand feasts upstairs would collapse into chaos, and the castle's image of power and refinement would crumble along with it. If the kitchen hierarchy kept the work flowing, it also created a constant undercurrent of politics, the kind that could be just as treacherous as anything happening in the great hall upstairs. Rank dictated not only duties, but also who you could speak to, who you could correct, and, most importantly, who you could safely ignore. For newcomers, understanding this unspoken map of authority was a matter of survival. A scullion, who corrected a senior assistant in front of others, might find themselves assigned to scraping the soot from the chimney flues, a task that left you coughing black dust for days. On the other hand, knowing how to quietly impress the right person could mean being bumped up to more skilled work, like pastry making or sauce preparation, which was not only cleaner, but came with the perk of tasting ingredients meant for the Lord's table. The steward, though not part of the kitchen proper, loomed over the entire operation. He was the bridge between the Lord's household and the kitchen staff, relaying orders from above and ensuring the head cook followed them to the letter. Stewards were notorious for micromanaging menus to match the political needs of the day. If a rival noble was visiting, the steward might demand a display of extravagance that strained the kitchen supplies for weeks afterward. While Mads technically held authority over what happened in the kitchen, he knew that defying the steward could cost him his position. The best head cooks learned to walk a fine line between asserting their expertise and giving the steward just enough control to feel important. Among the assistants, informal pecking orders developed. The roasting master might look down on the stew cook, claiming that handling meat over the open flame was a higher art than boiling vegetables in a pot. Bakers guarded their ovens like personal kingdoms, resenting anyone who interfered with their precise timing. Pastry cooks, when the castle was wealthy enough to employ one, held a strange prestige, because the decorative pies and sugar sculptures they created were among the most visible parts of a feast. A beautiful sugar swan or gilded tart could draw gasps from the nobility, and the pastry cook's name might actually be spoken in admiration upstairs, a rare honor in a profession built on invisibility. This hierarchy wasn't just about pride, it was about workload and risk. The closer your role was to the final product the nobility saw, the higher the stakes. A small error in the seasoning of a stew might be excused or hidden. A collapsed pastry or burned roast presented on the high table could be a public humiliation. This meant that some of the lower-ranked cooks preferred to stay where they were, doing hard but less visible work rather than risking the wrath that came with more prestigious assignments. It was a strange kind of job. Security. Being too far down the ladder to be noticed when things went wrong. Then there was the matter of perks, which the hierarchy distributed as carefully as duties. Access to the better ingredients was one of the clearest divides. The head cook and his immediate deputies had first pick of spices, fresh herbs, and prime cuts. They sampled dishes for seasoning, which meant tasting the best parts of the meal before anyone else. Mid-level cooks had access to decent leftovers, while the lowest workers ate from the servant's pot, which was essentially the culinary equivalent of sweeping crumbs off the table. On feast days, scraps from the high table might trickle down, but always after the lord, his guests, and the garrison had eaten their fill. The chain of command also acted as a system of apprenticeship. A sharp-eyed scullion might be noticed by an assistant and given small but important tasks, trimming meat, stirring sauces, or arranging platters. Over time, this could lead to a permanent role in that section of the kitchen. Skills were passed down in this way, though rarely with patience or gentleness. In an environment where time was always short, training meant being shown something once, then expected to repeat it flawlessly. Mistakes were met with a mix of shouted corrections, sharp cuffs, and, occasionally, grudging praise when something was done right. Favoritism inevitably crept into the system. An assistant who had the head cook's trust could make life easier for their preferred scullions. Better assignments, lighter workloads, or even an extra scrap of meat at the end of the day. Conversely, falling out of favour could mean months of the worst duties, carrying water, chopping onions until your eyes burned, or hauling refuse to the midden heap in the dead of winter. Navigating this social minefield required as much awareness as the actual cooking. Another layer of complexity came from gender roles in the kitchen. While many kitchens were male-dominated in heavy labour and butchery, women were often found in baking, brewing, and dairy work, as well as preparing herbs and vegetables. In some castles, women also worked as assistants or even held the role of head cook, though this was less common. Ellen, the breadmaster in Mads's kitchen, commanded as much respect as any man there, not just because she was skilled, but because she had a reputation for being unshakable under pressure. She knew how to speak sharply to a steward without crossing the line into insubordination, a skill that kept her in her post for years. The hierarchy extended beyond work into living arrangements. Higher-ranking kitchen staff might have small private rooms or share quarters with only one or two others. Lower staff often slept in crowded dormitories or even on the floor near the kitchen's dying embers. Proximity to the kitchen fire was both a blessing and a curse. Warmer in winter, but filled with smoke, and you were likely to be woken early when the first workers began stoking the hearths. It would be comforting to imagine that everyone in the kitchen shared a sense of camaraderie, united against the demands of the nobility, but the truth was more complicated. Competition for better positions, better food, and better treatment bred rivalries. Arguments over work allocation could flare into shouting matches, sometimes even physical scuffles, if tempers boiled over. Mads acted as both commander and peacekeeper, knowing that a divided kitchen was a slower, sloppier one, and that reflected badly on him. Yet for all its politics and pitfalls, the hierarchy served its purpose. It kept the food moving, the fires tended, and the lords fed. It offered a ladder, however rickety, for the ambitious to climb, and for those who had no desire or opportunity to move up. It provided a kind of stability, a predictable role, a place in the machine, and the knowledge that as long as they kept their head down, they could survive another day in the heat and chaos of the castle kitchen. Chapter 6. Feasts and Festivals. If the daily grind of a medieval Danish castle kitchen was a steady drumbeat of work, then feasts and festivals were the war drums, louder, faster, and utterly exhausting. A normal day demanded efficiency. A feast demanded perfection under impossible conditions. These were the moments when the castle showcased its wealth, power, and hospitality, and the kitchen was the engine that made that display possible. Every noble guest seated at the high table expected to be impressed, not just fed. Every dish had to be a statement, every course a carefully staged scene in the performance of authority. The first challenge was timing. In an age without refrigeration, you couldn't prepare everything days in advance. Meats needed to be roasted and served fresh, breads baked that morning, pies cooled just enough to slice cleanly without falling apart. The larger the guest list, the more delicate the coordination. It wasn't unusual for a feast to include 5 or 6 courses, each with multiple dishes, roasts, stews, fish, pastries, fresh fruit, cheese boards, and spiced wine, all of it needing to appear in the great hall in perfect order. If one course stalled, the entire flow was thrown off, and the embarrassment would ripple through the kitchen like a shockwave. The menu for a festival wasn't just about abundance, it was about spectacle. Nobles loved dishes that blurred the line between food and theatre. Whole animals might be roasted and then redressed in their own feathers or fur to appear lifelike on the platter. Pastry coffins, decorative crusts not meant to be eaten, could be shaped like castles, ships, or mythical beasts. Some feasts included subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures that depicted scenes from history or legend. These required a pastry cook with both artistic talent and nerves of steel, because even a slightly humid day could cause sugar to wilt into a sticky ruin. In Denmark, where winters were long and harsh, feasts often coincided with the changing of the seasons or religious festivals. Yuletide, Easter, and the midsummer celebrations were prime occasions for over-the-top banquets. The kitchen's task was to make the most of what was available at that time of year, and sometimes to conjure ingredients that shouldn't have been available at all. Imported oranges in midwinter, for example, were a sign of serious wealth and far-reaching trade connections. The more impossible the ingredient seemed, the more prestige it brought to the host. The logistics behind such displays were staggering. Meat for a large feast could include several whole deer, wild boar, swans, geese, and dozens of chickens. Hunting parties were often organized weeks in advance, not only to stock the larder, but to provide fresh kills for the event. Fish was brought in from coastal markets or nearby lakes, packed in barrels of salt, or, for higher quality, transported alive in tanks or wicker baskets lined with wet moss. Bakers worked through the night, producing endless loaves of bread, fine white loaves for the nobility, darker rye for everyone else. Allay and wine casks were rolled into position, tapped and tasted to ensure nothing sour reached the high table. This scale of preparation required the kitchen hierarchy to operate at maximum capacity. Mads acted more like a general than a cook during these days, assigning tasks with precision and expecting them to be carried out without hesitation. Assistants oversaw their sections like captains, each responsible for delivering their part of the meal on time. Scullions were worked to their limits, hauling water, cleaning pots, and plucking poultry until their hands cramped. Sleep was a luxury few enjoyed during feast preparations. Even when they left the kitchen, many lay awake thinking through the next day's tasks. And then there was the matter of waste, something the kitchen worked hard to avoid, but could never entirely prevent. The nobility liked to see tables groaning under the weight of food, far more than anyone present could possibly eat. Leftovers from the high table were sometimes redistributed to lower-ranking guests or servants, but much of the excess spoiled quickly without preservation. In some castles, this was a point of quiet resentment among the staff, who saw the waste as proof of the nobles' detachment from the realities of feeding people through the lean months. Feasts also carried political stakes. A well-received banquet could cement alliances, smooth over tensions, or impress visiting dignitaries enough to secure future support. A poorly executed one could do the opposite. Food that arrived cold, dishes that looked meagre, or service that seemed disorganized could be taken as insults, sometimes intentionally so. There are historical accounts of lords deliberately serving inferior wine or less meat to certain guests as a subtle way of showing displeasure. Whether intentional or not, the blame for such perceived slights often landed in the kitchen, even if the decision had been made elsewhere. From a cook's perspective, festivals were both exhilarating and terrifying. On the one hand, they offered the chance to show off skill and creativity, to make dishes that would be remembered for years. On the other, they exposed the kitchen to intense scrutiny. Any flaw was magnified in the glow of candlelight and the murmur of gossip, and while the guests would go home after the feast, the kitchen staff would still be there, scrubbing trays, scouring pots, and hauling away scraps long into the night. Perhaps the most exhausting part was the lack of reprieve afterward. A feast didn't mean a holiday for the kitchen. It meant returning to regular service the very next day, often with reduced supplies and even less sleep. In fact, some of the hardest work came after the guests had gone, when the kitchen had to reckon with what was left, preserving what could be saved and disposing of the rest before it attracted pests. Mads had learned to pace himself for these occasions, knowing that the true test of a feast wasn't the moment the final course was served, but whether the kitchen could still function in the days that followed. Feasts were the kitchen's great paradox, moments of pride and artistry that were also marathons of labour and risk. To the nobility, they were evidence of power and generosity. To the kitchen, they were proof that survival in this job required not just skill, but stamina, strategy, and the ability to keep smiling, or at least keep cooking, while the fires roared and the hours stretched endlessly on. Feasts in a medieval Danish castle were not simply large meals, they were cultural events, political tools, and elaborate performances of power. The calendar of such occasions was dictated as much by the church as by the seasons. Lent, Advent, and the major saints' days determined when meat could be served and when fish would dominate the table. Yuletide and Easter were especially grand, with kitchens preparing dishes that blended pagan seasonal customs with Christian symbolism. Roasted boar's head bedecked with rosemary for the winter solstice traditions, and lamb for Easter representing both fertility and the Paschal feast. These weren't just about taste, they were edible statements of faith, heritage, and status. Danish feasts often reflected the influence of the Hanseatic League trade routes, which brought ingredients and ideas from Germany, the Low Countries, and beyond. This meant that while the core of the menu remained rooted in local produce, pork, herring, rye bread, the high table might feature almond-based sauces from southern Europe, saffron-tinted pastries from Lübeck, or dried figs from the Mediterranean. Saffron, in particular, was a mark of extravagance. It had to travel thousands of miles, passing through the hands of multiple merchants, each adding their profit. By the time it reached Denmark, it was more valuable by weight than gold, and just a pinch could turn a loaf or pudding into a glowing yellow centerpiece. The range of dishes prepared for such events could be staggering. For a winter feast, the roasting fire might be loaded with venison, goose, and even swan, the latter reserved for the most prestigious occasions. Swans were not only difficult to catch, but also required special preparation to make them palatable. Their tough, gamey meat was softened with slow cooking and heavily spiced sauces, then presented with the skin and feathers reattached for dramatic effect. Fish dishes were equally elaborate, especially during fasting seasons. Eel pies, baked salmon in pastry, and illusion dishes, where one type of fish was disguised as another using colouring and sauce, were all part of the cook's repertoire. In summer, fresh produce allowed for brighter, more varied presentations. Trays of cherries, strawberries, and currants were arranged in decorative patterns, often alternating with plates of cheese or sugared almonds. Fresh herbs, flowers, and even edible gilding made the table a riot of colour and texture. Bread was not just a staple, but a form of decoration. Intricate loaves were braided, scored, and stamped with patterns before baking. These were placed where the nobility could admire them, while simpler loaves fed the rest of the household. One of the key challenges for Mads and his team was ensuring that everything reached the Great Hall at the right temperature, a task complicated by the fact that many medieval Danish kitchens were physically separated from the hall to reduce fire risk. This meant that hot dishes had to be carried across courtyards or along covered walkways, often in the wind, rain, or snow. Covered serving dishes, insulated with cloths or lined with heated stones, were essential to keeping food warm. Timing was everything. If one course lagged, the entire feast could be thrown into disarray. The order of service was itself a calculated display. The first course was designed to impress visually. Whole roasted animals, tall pastries, colourful jellies, establishing the tone of abundance. The middle courses offered variety and richness, layering flavours and textures to keep guests engaged. The final course, often sweet, left the strongest memory. In Danish castles, sweet meant not just fruit and honey, but also imported sugar, which was moulded into sculptures, pressed into candies, or dissolved into spiced wines. Serving sugar was more than a treat. It was a declaration that the host had access to one of the rarest commodities in Europe. Behind the scenes, the illusion of endless abundance was often achieved through sleight of hand. Decorative show dishes might be only partially edible, their cores filled with cheaper ingredients or even inedible supports to give them size and shape. Large roasts might be carved in the kitchen and arranged to look whole, allowing a smaller amount of meat to serve more guests. The high table's platters were replenished promptly, giving the impression of overflowing supply, while the lower tables made do with what was left. This careful orchestration ensured that no one of importance left unimpressed, even if the servants quietly grumbled over thin pottage later. Feasts also provided a rare opportunity for cooks to experiment. The risk was high, but so was the potential reward. A successful new dish could become a signature, remembered and requested for years. Failures, however, were not soon forgotten, and word of them could spread just as quickly as gossip about court intrigue. This meant that innovation had to be balanced with the tried and true. Mads knew which spice blends never failed to please, and which meats paired well with which sauces. Yet he also knew that nobles expected novelty, a dish they had not seen at their rival's table, something to boast about long after the night was over. The physical toll of these events on the kitchen staff was immense. For days leading up to the feast, sleep was reduced to a few stolen hours, and meals for the cooks themselves were whatever could be eaten quickly between tasks. Hands became blistered from chopping, arms sore from kneading, backs aching from carrying trays. Tempers frayed, and the combination of exhaustion, heat, and urgency meant arguments were common. Yet when the final course left the kitchen and the noise of the great hall swelled with laughter and applause, there was a certain satisfaction, not joy exactly, but the relief of having survived another trial by fire. Still, the next morning there was no true rest. The kitchen had to clean, take stock of remaining supplies, and begin preparations for whatever meals came next. A feast might be remembered in the great hall for its splendor, but in the kitchen it was remembered for its cost, measured not in coins or ingredients, but in the sweat, skill, and sheer endurance of those who made it possible. Chapter 7. Preserving food for the long winter. In a medieval Danish castle, winter was not just a season, it was a siege. It did not attack with armies, but with frost, darkness, and scarcity. For the kitchen, the battle began months before the first snow fell, in the careful, relentless work of preservation. Without these efforts, the great halls upstairs could go silent, not from famine in the village beyond the walls, but from hunger inside the lord's own household. It was not enough to prepare for today's meals. Mads and his staff had to prepare for the lean months when fresh food would be nothing but a memory. Preservation began in earnest in late summer and autumn, when the year's bounty had to be captured and held against the cold. Meat was a priority. Animals that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered in what was often called the killing time of late autumn. Pigs, sheep, and cattle were processed in quick succession, their meat divided between immediate use and storage. The most common method for long-term keeping was salting. Barrels were filled with thick layers of coarse salt, alternating with cuts of meat. The salt drew out moisture and created an environment inhospitable to bacteria, allowing pork, beef, and mutton to last for months. In a Danish castle, these barrels might fill entire sections of the larder, each one a small fortress of stored energy. Smoking was another favoured method, especially for pork and fish. Smoked hams and bacon were hung from beams in special smokehouses, small, dark buildings where a slow, steady fire of beech or oak burned day and night. The smoke not only flavoured the meat, but also helped keep insects and mould at bay. Fish smoking was so central to the region's diet that entire industries developed around it, particularly in coastal towns. Herring was salted, smoked, or both, then packed in barrels to be shipped inland. These barrels were as much a part of castle life as bread or ale. They were opened sparingly through the winter, often on fasting days dictated by the church. Drying was another tool in the preservation arsenal. Fish like cod and stockfish were gutted, cleaned, and left to air dry on racks in the cold wind, sometimes for weeks. This method turned the flesh hard as wood, requiring long soaking before it could be cooked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. A block of dried fish could keep for years if kept dry and free from pests. Meat could also be dried, though this was less common than smoking, given Denmark's damp winters. Vegetables posed a different challenge. The hardiest, turnips, carrots, parsnips and cabbages, were stored in cool, dark cellars where the temperature remained just above freezing. Cabbages were often pickled in brine, creating a fermented dish, not unlike sauerkraut, which not only preserved them, but also provided a vital source of vitamin C during the long months when fresh greens were unavailable. Onions and garlic were braided into ropes and hung from beams, where air circulation kept them from rotting. Beans and peas were dried and stored in sacks, ready to be boiled into thick stews when needed. Grain was both staple and currency, and its preservation was critical. After harvesting, it was stored in granaries, often in elevated structures to keep out moisture and rodents. Grain spoiled easily if damp, and a mold like ergot could make it lethal. Mads and the pantry staff inspected stores regularly, checking for signs of infestation. Rats were a constant threat, their gnawing teeth capable of destroying an entire sack of rye in a night. Cats patrolled the storerooms, but they were an imperfect defense. Sometimes the battle with vermin was simply a matter of replacing losses as quickly as they occurred. Dairy products were the most difficult to keep for long periods. Fresh milk lasted only hours without cooling, so it was quickly transformed into butter or cheese. Butter was salted heavily and packed into ceramic pots or wooden tubs, then stored in the coolest part of the larder. Cheese was aged, both to develop flavor and to make it less perishable. A wheel of hard cheese could last through the winter, though it might grow a rind thick enough to blunt a knife. In lean times, even hardened cheese was shaved thin to stretch supplies. Wine and ale were their own preservation challenges. Ale soured quickly if not consumed within weeks, so the kitchen kept a steady brewing schedule, ensuring that new batches were ready before old ones spoiled. Wine, when available, was kept in cool cellars, but even there it could turn to vinegar if the seal on the cask failed. Vinegar, however, was not a loss. It became a preservative in its own right, used to pickle vegetables or flavor dishes. Preservation was not purely about food safety, it was about rationing. The stores had to last from autumn slaughter until the next spring harvest. This meant strict control over how much could be taken at a time. Mads kept mental tallies of each barrel, sack and cask, knowing that an over-generous serving in January could lead to shortages in March. Sometimes, the kitchen would deliberately serve less appealing foods early in the winter to keep the finest stores for later. Dried fish might be the fare in January, while smoked ham was saved for a feast in February when the winter seemed longest. The church's fasting rules actually helped with this rationing. On fast days, which could number over 100 per year, meat was forbidden, and fish, grains, and vegetables took center stage. This gave the larder a chance to restock or simply stretch supplies further. Of course, for the nobility, fasting was a flexible concept. Elaborate fish dishes, rich with spices and sauces, were still an indulgence, even without meat. For all the careful planning, preservation was never foolproof. A mild winter could bring dampness that spoiled grain. A hard freeze could crack casks of ale. Salt stores could run low, forcing the kitchen to gamble on other methods. And no matter how well prepared the castle was, there was always the risk of outside pressures. A poor harvest among tenant farms, a failed herring season, or a disruption in trade routes, cutting off resupply. In those times, the real skill of a medieval cook was not just in preparing grand feasts, but in keeping people fed when the larder looked bare. Preservation was the invisible labor that kept the castle alive, a quiet victory against the slow siege of winter. The nobility might praise the splendor of a feast, but they rarely praised the salted pork stew in February that kept them from hunger. For Mads, that was fine. Praise didn't fill the larder. Salt, smoke, and discipline did. Chapter 7. Preserving food for the long winter. The art of preservation in a medieval Danish castle was not a single skill, but a whole web of interconnected practices, each one vulnerable to failure in its own way. To survive the winter, the kitchen had to think like a merchant, a farmer, and a soldier all at once, counting stocks, forecasting needs, and defending the stores against a dozen invisible enemies. It wasn't just a matter of filling barrels and hanging meat, it was a season-long chess game against time, weather, and hunger. One of the most important tools in this game was salt, so essential that wars had been fought over access to it. Denmark itself had limited natural salt sources, which meant much of it came from trade with the Hanseatic League or from salt works in Lüneburg far to the south. The arrival of a salt shipment at the castle was a moment of both relief and risk. Relief, because without salt the meat and fish could not be kept. Risk, because if the shipment was late or the quality poor, the entire winter's preservation plan could unravel. Salt was stored in covered bins, away from damp, and rationed almost as carefully as the food it protected. A shortage meant making hard choices, deciding which cuts of meat to save and which to use immediately. Trade dependency extended beyond salt. While the castle could preserve much of its own meat, fish, and vegetables, certain luxuries relied entirely on outside suppliers. Barrels of dried figs, sacks of almonds, and amphorae of imported olive oil were not daily fare, but they were vital for feasts and for currying favour with visiting dignitaries. These goods travelled long, perilous routes, changing hands many times. A single storm in the Baltic or a pirate raid along the coast could delay or destroy a shipment, and the kitchen would be left to improvise with local substitutes. Almond milk, for example, was a prized ingredient in Lenten dishes. When almonds failed to arrive, cooks might use ground hazelnuts instead, though the nobility rarely appreciated the substitution. Preservation also had a defensive aspect, literally. In times of siege, the stores became the castle's lifeline. A well-provisioned castle could hold out for months. A poorly managed one might fall in weeks without a single breach in the walls. This meant that Mads, like any competent head cook, thought in terms of both daily consumption and emergency reserves. Certain barrels, sacks, and jars were marked for crisis use only, locked in a secure section of the larder and opened only on the steward's direct order. In peacetime, this might seem overly cautious. In wartime, it was the difference between survival and surrender. Shortages were an inevitable part of life, even without the threat of siege. A failed harvest could empty the grain stores months early, forcing reliance on imports that came at ruinous prices. A poor fishing season might reduce the supply of herring and cod, both staples of the fasting calendar. In such years, the kitchen's ingenuity was tested to its limits. Thin broths replaced thick stews. Meat was minced and stretched with breadcrumbs, and root vegetables were boiled down until they all but dissolved. The goal was to make each serving look more generous than it was, a sleight of hand that kept morale up while the supplies quietly dwindled. Fermentation played a critical role in extending the life of perishable foods, and it went far beyond simple pickling. Grain was brewed into ale, not just for its flavour, but because ale kept longer than water and was safer to drink. In Denmark, where brewing was often done on a household scale, the castle kitchen operated like a small brewery, maintaining a rotation of casks to ensure a steady supply. Surplus milk in summer was turned into cultured dairy products, soured milk, buttermilk, and soft cheeses, all of which kept longer than fresh milk and could be used in cooking. Even fish could be fermented, though this was a pungent process that made the larders nearly unbearable during the early stages. Temperature control was another constant challenge. Before the invention of ice houses, natural cold was the only refrigeration available. In deep winter, frozen rivers and lakes provided ice that could be stored in cellars insulated with straw and earth, though this was labour-intensive and not always practical. More often, Preservation relied on finding the coldest, driest spots in the castle. Sometimes underground chambers, sometimes drafty upper rooms. The placement of storage was a deliberate decision. Grains in dry areas safe from rodents, salted meat in cool, ventilated spaces, and root vegetables in slightly damp cellars to prevent shriveling. Not all preservation was about longevity. Some was about timing. Certain foods were held back deliberately to peak at the right moment. Game birds like pheasant or partridge might be hung for several days before cooking to allow the meat to tenderize, a process that modern sensibilities might call controlled decay. While dangerous if misjudged, it was a valued practice among the nobility, who prized the richer flavor it produced. Mads knew exactly how long each type of meat could hang before crossing the line from aged to inedible, a skill honed by years of trial and error. Religious observance shaped the preservation cycle as much as the seasons. The church's fasting calendar was strict, and with over 100 days a year when meat was forbidden, fish and preserved vegetables had to fill the gap. This made salted and smoked fish essential, but it also meant that supplies had to be carefully timed. Too much fish eaten early in Lent could leave the latter weeks grimly repetitive, with the same dried herring appearing day after day. Clever cooks varied sauces and accompaniments to disguise the monotony, using mustard, vinegar, or herbs to change the flavor profile. One of the unspoken truths about preservation was that it was not equally effective for everyone in the castle. The nobility had first claim on the freshest and finest stores. The garrison received reliable but simpler fare. The servants ate what was left, and if shortages came, they felt it first. This hierarchy of access meant that preservation was as much a social system as a culinary one, reinforcing the idea that even in hunger, rank dictated your place at the table. In the end, the success of preservation was measured not by how much food was stored in autumn, but by how much remained come spring. A well-stocked larder in November meant nothing if it was empty by March. The cook's reputation rose and fell on this balance. Too generous and the winter ended in want, too frugal and the household grumbled about meagre portions. Mads understood this tightrope intimately. Preservation was not the glamorous side of cooking, but without it there would be no feasts, no daily bread, no life inside the castle walls when winter's grip closed in. Chapter 8. The Politics of the Pantry. In a medieval Danish castle, the pantry was more than a storeroom, it was a vault of power. Whoever controlled it had influence over the stomachs, and therefore the moods, of everyone from the lowest scullion to the lord himself. And in an age where hospitality was currency and food shortages could spark rebellion, the politics of that space could be as cutthroat as any intrigue in the great hall. The pantry was where supply met demand, where ration met privilege, and where alliances were cemented over wedges of cheese and barrels of wine. The pantryman or larderer, depending on the division of duties, was often a trusted officer in the household. His responsibilities went beyond simply locking and unlocking the storeroom door. He kept detailed tallies, often in chalk on boards or in wax tablets, of everything that came in and went out. Barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, jars of honey, wheels of cheese, amphorae of oil and wine. Each item was accounted for, at least in theory. In practice, the numbers could be adjusted for a price or a favor. Access to the goods stores was a bargaining chip, and those in charge knew how to use it. Inside the kitchen, Mads had to walk a fine line with the pantry keeper. Too many requests for rare or expensive ingredients could raise eyebrows, but too few and the high table might suffer. The pantry was also where the tension between thrift and extravagance played out daily. The Lord Steward might want the finest cuts of beef served at every meal, while Mads knew that doing so would deplete winter stores too quickly. Sometimes the head cook and pantry keeper worked together to stretch supplies, quietly substituting a well-prepared but less costly ingredient. But if politics upstairs demanded a show of wealth, those strategies went out the window. The pantry's political role extended to the entire castle hierarchy. Servants in good standing with the pantry keeper might find themselves with extra bread, better ale, or a wedge of cheese slipped into their meal. Those out of favour could be left with thin stew and stale loaves. This small-scale favouritism might seem petty, but it could influence morale as much as a pay raise or punishment. In hard winters, when supplies tightened, the pantry's decisions on who ate what could quietly shape the castle's internal alliances. The pantry also intersected with the patronage system of medieval hospitality. Visiting nobles, clerics, or wealthy merchants were often given gifts from the castle stores: a wheel of aged cheese, a cask of wine, a sack of fine flour. These were not mere tokens of friendship. They were investments in political relationships. A well-chosen food gift could secure goodwill or remind an ally of the castle's generosity. But every gift meant something missing from the stores, and Mads sometimes found himself calculating how to make up the difference in the weeks ahead. Control of the pantry also played a role in the castle's public image. A well-stocked larder implied a prosperous lord, capable of feeding his people and guests without straying. On the other hand, rumours of empty barrels or rationing could suggest weakness, making the castle a target for opportunistic neighbours. This was why some pantry inventories were deliberately staged, with full barrels placed near the entrance for visitors to see, while the less impressive stores were kept deeper inside. There was also the matter of religious obligations. In Denmark, as elsewhere in medieval Europe, lords were expected to feed the poor on certain feast days or during times of scarcity. The pantry played a central role in this charity, or in the appearance of it. Distributions were often public events, with the lord or lady overseeing the handing out of bread, fish, or pottage to villagers. It was good for the castle's reputation, but the real work, deciding how much could be spared without threatening the household's own needs, fell to the pantry and kitchen staff. Mads had learned to prepare for these occasions with careful substitutions, making sure the charity was generous enough to be noticed, but not so generous that the stores suffered for months afterward. Then there were the less savoury politics: theft, smuggling, and black market trade. Even in a well-run household, food disappeared. A handful of raisins from a barrel here, a bit of cheese shaved off a wheel there. Individually minor, collectively significant. In times of shortage, such thefts could become more organised, with goods quietly leaving the castle through servants' networks to be sold in local markets. Catching thieves was tricky. Punishing them could be politically dangerous, especially if they had protectors among the staff or even in the lord's household. The pantry was also a place where information flowed. Servants delivering goods, merchants dropping off supplies, and kitchen workers collecting ingredients all brought news with them. Gossip about local politics, trade prices, or events in nearby towns. A pantry keeper who listened carefully could gather intelligence as valuable as any spy's report. This made him an important, if unofficial, advisor in the castle's affairs. Mads often stopped there, not just for ingredients, but to hear the latest rumours that might affect the kitchen. Whether a shipment of herring was delayed, or a noble guest had a particular dislike for garlic. What made the politics of the pantry so complex was that it operated on multiple levels at once. On the surface, it was about food management, keeping the larder stocked, supplies fresh, and meals on schedule. Beneath that, it was about influence. Who had access to the best goods? Who could grant favours? Who could subtly punish? And beneath that, it was about survival, ensuring that, no matter what happened in the unpredictable world outside the castle walls, the people inside would have enough to eat until spring returned. For Mads, navigating these layers was as much a part of his job as roasting a perfect joint of venison. A well-timed request, a quiet word in the right ear, or a careful compromise could mean the difference between a well-fed winter and a season of shortages. In the politics of the pantry, food was never just food. It was leverage, currency, and a measure of control over the entire household. If the pantry was a vault of power, then its politics were written in chalk dust and grease, in the faint scratches of tally marks that decided who ate well and who waited for scraps. In Danish castles, the room itself had a name with weight, fardebur, and the man who managed it often styled larderer or pantryman, guarded it with a seriousness that would make a gaoler proud. Keys hung on a ring at his belt. Sometimes there were 2 locks and 2 key holders, so no one could open a barrel alone, a medieval 2-factor authentication born from hard lessons. The ledgers were not fancy parchment ledgers, as much as wax tablets and tally sticks, notches paired between steward and supplier, snapped so that only the matching halves proved the account. When a cart arrived from a tenant farm or a Hanseatic merchant trundled in with a wine cask stamped from Lübeck, the pantryman counted, the steward peered, and Mads waited with the patience of a man who knew that an extra day wasted on ceremony could turn meat from acceptable to, we'll call it, sauce. The best larder masters developed an instinct you could not teach. They could thump a barrel with the heel of the hand and hear if the pickle brine was low, sniff a sack and decide if the rye had taken damp on the road, or tilt a wine cask and know whether a thrifty merchant had topped it with vinegar and piety. None of this made them popular, which is why politics settled in the pantry like dust on a beam, soft, constant, and impossible to completely remove. Real cases of pantry power were rarely dramatic. They were cumulative. A garrison captain who received a steadier ale allowance, because the men are drilling, quietly returned to favour by assigning 2 soldiers to help unload salt on a rainy afternoon. A priest who preached temperance in the chapel nevertheless left with a neat parcel of white bread and a pot of honey for the sick, which just happened to coincide with the bishop's visit next week. The bailiff who squeezed rents from peasants, liked his cheese slightly younger. Somehow his preferred wheels appeared in his saddlebags whenever arrears needed mercy. And the lensmand, the Lord's chief officer for the wider estate, had opinions about herring prices in Skåne. A pantryman who agreed in public might find next month's tax cart weighed a little lighter. None of this was written in any ordinance. All of it shaped what the kitchen could do. Mads understood that the pantry's chalk marks were a shadow budget running parallel to his menus. He played his part with calculated humility. When he needed almonds for a Lenten sauce, and the jar was suspiciously light, he did not accuse. He lamented the sorrow of serving a visiting canon, a sauce made from hazelnuts when the canon's palate was known to be delicate. The pantryman, who very much wished to be the quiet hero of delicate palates, produced a reserve cone of sugar and a second jar of almonds from a shelf that, officially, did not exist. When Ellen needed fine flour for manche loaves to please the lady's French cousin, she did not say, "Give me wheat." She sighed thoughtfully, wondering aloud how unfortunate it would be if the cousin were to remark that the bread at Albrogis was lighter than here. The pantryman, whose pride took wounds like a knight's, opened the chest. Flattery was currency in a system where coin was scarce and surveillance was patchy. Not all politics were kind. Accusations of theft were a seasonal sport. In winter, when the fat on every bacon side seemed to thin faster than memory, disagreements sharpened. A scullion caught tucking a heel of cheese in his sleeve swore he was delivering it to the kennel master. The kennel master swore he had asked the pantry. The pantry swore he had given no such order. The steward, who loved morality more than truth, declared a day of fasting for the servants' hall to teach vigilance. Mads learned to intervene before such righteousness emptied his workforce. He accepted the steward's decree in public, then spent the next week ladling thicker pottage for the lowest tables and slipping the kennel master a bag of coarse oats for the hounds. Politics, like stew, was kept from burning by constant stirring. There were, from time to time, audits, rituals with the seriousness of a liturgy and roughly the same results. The steward would summon the pantryman, the larderer, Mads, and 2 sober-faced clerks with goose quills. They opened casks, weighed cheeses, measured grain with standard bushels, and tapped wine with a gauging rod marked like a pilgrim's staff. Figures were muttered, fingers licked, lines scraped in wax. The outcome seldom surprised anyone. Minor discrepancies explained by shrinkage, spoilage, mice bold enough to eat through oak. Once, a wine cask was judged 10 cups short. The pantryman swore the cooper had left a thicker stave. The cooper, dragged in from his shed, swore on St. Botvid it was standard. The steward, who preferred order to carpentry, find the kitchen a day's ration of spices because someone had to pay. And the next week, miraculously, a merchant friend of the pantry produced a very affordable replacement cask of passable Rhenish, discounted for holy uses. Beyond the walls, the pantry's politics leaned on markets. The twin herring fairs at Scanor and Falsterbo decided more menus than piety did. If the shoals were abundant and the barrels cheap, Lent felt generous. If storms scattered the catch, prices climbed, and righteousness tasted suspiciously like watered pottage. Grain carts jolted in from tenant farms with rents rendered in rye, oats, and a narrow ribbon of wheat reserved for the high table. If the harvest ran thin, the pantry stretched rations with legalistic finesse. Measures ladled with a heavier hand for the guard post by the gate, a lighter one for laundry workers, just enough for the brewhouse to keep ale at working strength rather than cheerful. In good years, the Fadeburg glowed with smug barrels, an exhibition staged for passing cousins and passing rumours. In bad years, the door was kept closed, and the key was a sermon about prudence. Religion provided both structure and loophole. Fasting ruled many days. The pantry translated this into fish allocations and vegetable jars with an accountant's zeal. But a clever pantryman also knew the theology of exception. The sick were allowed broth for strength. Travellers breaking a fast for necessity could be granted eggs. Pregnant women, noble widows, and especially valuable guests seemed to discover pious reasons why almond milk with sugar counted as medicinal. Every dispensation was a small performance with tangible costs. When Mads saw a run of piety approaching, he ordered eel pies instead of pike and let mustard cover the sin of repetition. Ellen baked honeyed rye to cushion the absence of meat. Thus did doctrine and logistics dance their uneasy minuet, feet stepping neatly while toes were often trod upon. Information was the pantry's other harvest. Merchants spoke more freely while unloading sacks. Soldiers liked to lean in doorways. Courier boys bragged about roads as if they had paved them. From this stream the pantryman sifted what mattered. A bridge out meant flour would be late. A rumour of tolls at the ford meant wine pricier next month. A whisper that the Lord's neighbour had hosted a goose stuffed with apples and prunes meant the great hall upstairs would soon crave a miracle of equal height. Mads did not dismiss gossip. He seasoned with it. If the neighbour's feast glittered, he asked for saffron for the custards and gold leaf for one tart, spending 2 weeks' sugar in one shimmering insult. If famine scratched at the village, he urged the steward to stage arms at the gate, bread and fish given under the lady's gaze, and planned a servant's meal that was marginally kinder than the last. Cynicism did not preclude compassion, it just budgeted it. Sometimes the pantry's politics broke into scandal. A wheel of cheese vanished entirely, not sliced into invisibility but gone like a saint's bone. The steward wanted the lash, the pantryman wanted dignity, Mads wanted the next week's menu to survive. He proposed an ordeal of honesty. Each worker swore before the chapel lamp, and each was given a chance to confess in private. No one did. The cheese reappeared 2 days later, a little lighter, on a cart bound for the priest's sister's wedding. The steward pretended it had been misplaced in the outer store. The pantryman wrote a new rule. No goods left the Fadeburg without 2 signatures, and the steward's quill mark in red. The rule held for a month, which, in pantry time, was practically canon law, and there were subtler betrayals. A merchant brought pepper adulterated with berry husk. Mads caught it between finger and tooth, that gritty lie you can taste. He rejected the barrel. The pantryman murmured that the price had been excellent. The steward hissed that the Lord expected black pepper as at Helsinger. Mads took the better cask at twice the price, cut an ounce with ginger to stretch it, and swore Ellen to keep the spice chest locked even when the steward's shadow fell over it. Upstairs, guests asked what made the venison so fine. Downstairs, the pantryman made a note to never buy from that merchant again, unless the price was heavenly or the bishop was in town. Integrity, like salt, was precious. You used it to keep rot at bay, but you could not spend it recklessly. All the while, the garrison ate by measure. Their ration was its own politics, measured with a ladle that doubled as a barometer of the Lord's mood. On days when patrols returned soaked and sullen, the pantry sent an extra strip of bacon to the guardhouse kettle. On days when a brawl in the yard embarrassed the household, the ale arrived thinner, for discipline. The captain understood the language. He kept his men's fists tight, and their mouths shut when the lord's cousins visited, and the pantry repaid him with a side of pork found behind the salt bins. Even justice needed allies. Through it all, Mads cultivated the pantry the way a gardener coaxes fruit from poor soil. He never asked for luxuries without offering a practical exchange. Give me wheat flour for the lady's cousin, and I will turn the servant's oats into a thrice-boiled mash that wastes nothing. Allow me 2 cones of sugar for subtleties, and I will flavour the next 3 weeks of fish so cleverly that no one remembers the price. Ellen, practical as iron, delivered proof. Loaves that rose high enough to flatter a steward, crusts dark enough to hide a tight hand on the woodpile. Their victories were not celebrations. They were continuities. The pantry remained locked, the chalk renewed, the tally sticks mated and filed. Power did not announce itself with trumpets in the fade burr. It nodded, counted, and shut the door. By spring, when the cellars exhaled their last cold breath, and the first carts nudged up the hill with greens that smelled like hope, the ledger told a story only a few would read. A winter survived without famine, a feast given that still left barrels for Lent's final weeks, a gift sent to a neighbour that bought peace more cheaply than mercenaries. No ballad would praise a pantryman's prudence or a cook's quiet bargains. The great halls celebrated stags and songs. But the castle did not live on venison alone. It lived on the politics of bread and brine, on the negotiations behind a closed door, on the unglamorous arithmetic of keeping people fed without admitting how close they came, every year, to hunger. And if that sounds unromantic, remember that romance cannot keep in a barrel. Salt can, keys can, and the patient, cynical mercy of a well-run pantry most certainly can. Chapter 9. Feeding the Garrison. When the castle kitchen wasn't staging banquet magic for lords and visiting ambassadors, it was feeding a far more demanding and pragmatic crowd, the garrison. Soldiers didn't need fancy sugar sculptures, only calories, heartiness, and sometimes a stiff ale to wash down the day's dangers. For the medieval cook, balancing that was like juggling cannonballs while wearing armour. The garrison ate not for luxury, but necessity, and neglecting them could invite mutiny as fast as failing to spiff up the high table could cost a cook his position. The numbers were serious. A mid-sized Danish castle garrison could run to several dozen men or more. When men-at-arms were quartered inside, that meant daily deliveries of thick, protein-dense pottage, sturdy rye breads, salted meat, and ale. Whereas the nobility might dine on rooster steeped in almonds or venison roasted over coals, the garrison got coarse grains, salted pork, and the occasional herring. But no less vital, it was the garrison that guarded the castle walls, served as clan muscle in raids, and enforced the lord's law. Feed them poorly, and they'd watch the kitchen door instead of the outer one, and sharp swords were easily mistaken for blunt force. Logistics demanded ruthless efficiency. Barrels of salted meat and fish were allocated by duty roster, more for men on guard duty, less for men at rest. Bread was baked in batches, smaller, dense loaves for the soldiers, lighter loaves for the hall. The ovens ran in shifts. One team baked loaves for guests, another churned pottage for the walls. Brewing ale for the soldiers was a priority. Boiling killed bacteria, and the almost foul taste of day-old ale was still safer than stagnant water. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival. Even so, there was a hierarchy within the garrison. The captain might draw an extra strip of bacon for the mind's fortitude, and the sergeants might sip a stronger ale. Foot soldiers often received thin gruel of barley with whatever scrap of meat could stretch. If supplies tightened, the nobility got fat, and the soldiers got bone broth. Soldiers whispered rumours of privilege fat in the great hall, while their porridge turned to mush. Typical drama in a kitchen that served status before sausages. The kitchen's politics extended into the barracks. Captain and steward sometimes negotiated over salt. Too much for the soldiers, it might shorten stores for the feast. Too little, and discipline would break. Soldiers were gruff but practical. A good cook earned their respect by slipping a slightly better bread loaf under the sergeant's sandwich or adding a pinch of onion to the stew. These small gestures mattered. For every soldier, the kitchen was a frontline supporter or an obstacle. Seasonal change meant different demands. In summer, salted fish made frequent appearances in the garrison's vessel. Winter meant salted pork or salted whale blubber from the coast, hearty if pungent. Root vegetables and hard cheeses filled the gaps during long watches. But let a supply cart fail, let the herring boat suffer low catch, and soldiers were suddenly watching the food stores with envy rather than the moat with duty. Disease was another pressure. Poor diet weakened bodies, and outbreaks of dysentery or scurvy were nightmares in the barracks. The cook, Mads, had to balance flavour with health. Several boiled kale leaves or fermented cabbage, primitive sauerkraut, might be slipped into the pottage ingredients not praised in the feast, but lauded by doctors later. Subtlety paid off, scurvy is silent, until it's deadlier. If soldiers stayed healthy, none of the nobility blamed the cook. If they didn't, the kitchen took the fall. Sometimes, soldiers got leftovers from the Great Hall under the guise of morning rations. Big cuts carved off platters might be reheated and sent down, but with minimal seasoning and no fanfare. This preserved appearances upstairs while shoring up morale below. Hard sailors even told war stories backward, saying they had tasted the same roast as lords. The story mattered more than reality. The garrison and the high table shared one thing. They were both political variables. A well-fed garrison showed strength to besiegers. A feast entertained allies. But the kitchen had only so many ovens, firewood, and pots. Mads balanced those demands like a tightrope walker in a flame-lit chamber, between gratitude and grumbling, survival and spectacle, boiled grain and gilded pastry. The unsung art of garrison cooking lay not in elegance but in endurance, making food last, keeping soldiers fed and sober enough to hold the walls, while still lighting platters with spice and impression upstairs. The cook's true victory was a tavern floor that stayed quiet, walls that stood unbreached, and the lord's table full, alongside a pot still hot in the servant's kith, waiting for tomorrow's watch. If the great hall measured a lord's prestige in peacocks and pastry, the yard measured it in bellies that could march, drill, and keep watch at midnight without wobbling. Feeding a medieval Danish garrison was arithmetic with consequences, calories, salt, and heat, in exchange for vigilance at the parapet. The steward liked to think he controlled morale with pay tallies in marks and ore. Mads knew better. Wages were promises. Supper was proof. A man who had chewed real food would stand his turn on the wall when sleet came sideways across the moat. A man who hadn't would stare at the pantry door as if rebellion were a latch. The ration tables were never written as poetry, but they read like doctrine. On an ordinary day, each soldier drew coarse rye bread, dense wheels baked low and slow, so they kept, as well as a ladle of pottage built from barley, peas, onions, and whatever grease the kitchen could spare. Salted pork shaved thin gave the pot flavour. On fish days the meat vanished, and in slid chunks of soaked herring or eel. When the gates were quiet and patrols short, that was enough. On training days the captain appeared in the kitchen with an affable cough and a not-so-affable look, and asked for sturdier broth, which meant more fat skimmed from the roasting hearth, and an extra handful of peas to make the spoon stand upright. If the watch bill doubled storm, rumours, a noble feud breathing hot, the ration followed, because hungry men bargain with discipline, and discipline loses. Ale was the other pillar, and no, it wasn't decadence. Small ale, brewed weak and consumed young, was safer than the well, and kept men hydrated without turning the barracks into a tavern riot. The castle brewery ran like a mill wheel, mashing yesterday, boiling today, fermenting tomorrow, casking the day after. Stronger ale, reserved for paydays and victories, lived in the butler's custody, not the garrison's. When grain ran tight, Mads leaned on oats. When hops were thin, he shrugged toward gruet herb mixes that made modern drinkers wince and medieval soldiers merely grunt. The point was not bliss. The point was a clean gut and a steady hand gripping a spear at dawn. Logistics took the romance out of soldiering. Bread had to be portioned by weight, not charity. Loaves cooled on racks marked for the yard, the kitchen, the hall. The larderer measured meat with a knife that cut resentment thin. Rashers for men on the north wall where the wind bit hardest. Bones and broth for the gate crew who at least had a brazier. Cheese came in hard wedges that tolerated travel and indifference. When patrols rode out, Mads packed foods that survived a saddlebag. Oatcakes baked almost dry, smoked sausage, dried apples if luck had smiled in autumn, and a twist of salt to keep thirst honest. No one sang about oatcakes, but men returned with them. That, in a castle ledger, counted as music. Siege doctrine haunted every quiet month. The yard drilled with extra pikes because iron looked like comfort when carts did not appear. The kitchen ran siege rehearsals that no one called by name. A week where the garrison's meat ration shifted from pork to fish to something hearty with more peas. A polite phrase for cutting fat without cutting face. Water stores were checked, cistern lids tarred, and the pickling brine tested by taste, law, and the pantryman's knuckle. If arrows darkened a sky in some neighbour's story, Mads doubled the vinegar order, because cabbage in a barrel beats courage in a song when spring refuses to hurry. The captain knew exactly what such weeks meant and said nothing. He watched the men. If they grumbled only as much as the weather, the rehearsal had passed. Disease sat at the table, whether invited or not. The barracks were clean by the standards of men who lived with iron and leather, which is to say not at all by a monk's. Dysentery loved sloppy wells and raw pride. Mads counted with boiling, herbs that nunneries praised, and souring, ale wurts, buttermilk, and pickled greens slipped into the pottage, even when the sergeant muttered that cabbage softened the will. Winter scurvy was a quieter thief, stealing gums before it stole grip. Fermented cabbage and onions kept it at bay. Dried rose hips, when the ladies' herb garden had been attentive, were a miracle that arrived tart and late. No one toasted the cook for avoiding an outbreak. Everyone blamed him if one came. Justice in a castle wore kitchen stains. Discipline rode in on the ration ladle. After a brawl, the steward ordered the ale lightened for the yard, and the men tasted the lesson immediately. After a week of excellent watches in foul weather, surplus bacon found its way into the kettle, and morale climbed more solidly than any sermon. Mads despised moral theatre, but played it fluently. When the captain needed men to haul timber, the kitchen produced a pot that smelled like promise. Onion, fat, a whisper of pepper saved from some feast's shadow, and the yard moved faster. When a visiting cousin of the lord demanded more spitboys and the kitchen ran thin, the garrison received an extra crust's ration the next day, wrapped in clean cloth as if honour were edible. It worked. Soldiers do not require beauty. They require to be remembered. Supply routes added dice to the menu. Carts from tenant farms stuttered in mud. Herring from Scorn rose and fell with weather and politics. Hanseatic merchants smiled with all their teeth when stocks were low. The pantry's quiet favours, an extra measure for the gate, a better wheel of cheese for the captain, were not generosity but insurance premiums paid against a bad fortnight. When barrels of poor fish arrived, Mads soaked them longer, boiled them with mustard, and paired them with hot bread. Men complained less when warmth and sharpness reached the tongue first. When jerky rumour said the neighbour lord had served his men venison at Candlemas, the captain did not repeat it, and Mads did not ask, and the pantryman found 2 kettles of pork bones for stock that weekend. War was not declared, but comparisons always are. Garrison meals had a choreography that looked like chaos to anyone from upstairs. Messes formed by habit, 4 or 6 men sharing a bowl, passing bread, ranking bites by seniority because habit keeps knives in sheaths. The cook watched which bowls came back clean and which returned with sullen scrapings. He adjusted salt before the sergeant adjusted men. Alan, who understood men as well as yeast, sent crusts slightly thicker on nights before midnight watch, because chewing buys time, and time buys patience, and patience buys the next hour without a shout. These were small mercies. They held walls. Criticism is cheap, and Mads owned plenty. He thought it absurd that the Lord could weigh a feast's brilliance by a sugar swan, while the men who kept that swan alive by keeping raiders off the road negotiated dignity from a ladle. He said none of this aloud. He fed the hall well enough to keep its vanity docile, and fed the yard well enough to keep its strength honest. If that sounds like cynicism, it is because the kitchen has no word for miracles, only for margins. The garrison lived in those margins, between enough and not quite, between loyalty and the arithmetic of hunger. When spring finally threw green over the ditch, the captain toasted with small ale, the steward declared the provisioning a triumph of management, and Mads salted another side of pork without comment. The wall had not fallen. That was the only banner the kitchen ever asked to hang. Chapter 10. The Last Feast. If you think a medieval cook's career ended with applause in the Great Hall, you've been listening to too many courtly ballads. In reality, the final act for most was not a golden ladle or a toast from the Lord, but the same thing that ended all service roles in a castle: a quiet shift in power, a budget cut, or the slow erosion of joints and eyesight, until the kitchen heat became a torment instead of a craft. But Mads, for all his grumbling, had lasted longer than most, long enough to see the kitchen's rhythms change with the decades, and to know exactly what a last feast really meant. It started like any other grand day in the Danish calendar. Spring had fully returned, the ice was gone from the moat, and the orchard smelled of apple blossom. Guests were expected from 2 nearby estates, and word from the steward was clear: the table had to impress without bankrupting the pantry. That paradox had been the cook's problem for centuries: produce excess while spending nothing. And it always came down to the same tricks: disguise the cheap, stretch the rare, and keep the fire bright enough to distract from whatever the meat actually was. By this point, Mads had the ledger of the castle in his head: how many salted hams remained, which barrels of beer could be broached without starting a feud with the butler, which herbs were early enough in the garden to pass for exotic. He chose a menu that looked noble, but leaned heavily on what the season offered. Fresh trout from the moat's tributary was dressed with parsley, vinegar, and oil from last year's trade with Lübeck. The roasts for the hall were mostly mutton dressed as venison, marinated long enough in wine and juniper to pass muster in dim candlelight. Trenchers of coarse bread doubled as plates for the lesser guests, saving washing and flour in one stroke. The garrison would not taste the trout or the venison. They were fed a deep pottage of barley, cabbage, and whatever bones the carving floor yielded, enriched with bacon fat from the hall's preparations. And here lay one of the cook's unspoken talents, ensuring that even on a day of display, the people who kept the gates and the walls still received something hot and filling. In Mads's mind, keeping the soldiers upright and the noble guests flattered were the same job, fail either, and the kitchen would bear the blame. Preparation for a feast was less about artistry and more about logistics at scale. The bakery ovens were fired before dawn, crews of boys hauled water until their shoulders ached, and every able pair of hands was pressed into chopping, pounding, or turning spits. The scullions suffered the worst jobs, gutting fish, scraping pots thick with yesterday's grease. But even here, Mads enforced a certain grim discipline. A cook's authority was not granted by the Lord. It was taken and maintained in the heat of the kitchen. In a world where one spoiled dish could sour a noble mood, Mads kept his underlings working as if the devil himself had ordered the feast. There were moments of absurd theatre. The lady of the castle appeared to supervise the spicing of a dish, scattering a few petals of imported saffron into a pot, as if her touch alone would make the meal divine. Mads bowed, bit his tongue, and knew she had just used enough saffron to equal a month's wage for the gate guards. The steward paced the passageway with a ledger, occasionally tutting about costs, as if the feast had not already been approved by the Lord himself. Upstairs, they spoke of hospitality as though it were a virtue. Downstairs, in the kitchen, it was measured in hours without sleep and cuts on your hands from a careless cleaver. When the feast began, the kitchen became an engine of noise and movement. Dishes had to leave in the right order: broths and pottages first, then roasted meats, then subtleties. those delicate sugar or pastry constructions designed purely to impress. The service itself was an elaborate ballet. Servers entered in procession, displayed each dish to the Lord, and then brought it to the guests. In the kitchen, of course, none of this grace existed. There it was shouting, splashing, the slap of knives on wood, the crackle of fat dripping into flames. Mads stood at the centre, shouting orders over the din, while Elin kept a quiet eye on the seasoning pots, adjusting where the rush had dulled the flavours. For all the tension, there was a strange satisfaction in watching the work leave the kitchen in great steaming waves. You did not see the guests eat. You knew only that the plates came back scraped clean or half-finished. Clean meant praise. Half-finished meant gossip later about whether the meat had been too tough, the fish too cold, the sauce too heavy. Mads didn't believe in perfection. He believed in survival. And on this day, survival meant that every dish left more or less on time. Nothing fell to the floor. And the Lord's mood stayed bright enough that he raised his cup toward the kitchen door at the end of the night. And then it was over. The hall fell to murmurs. The guests stumbled toward their chambers, and the kitchen began the endless work of cleaning. The great spits cooled. The pot scraping began, and the floor was sanded to absorb the day's spills. The garrison settled to their own meal, a little richer than usual from the feast's leavings. Mads walked the kitchen one last time, speaking little. He knew this was likely his final service. His hands ached in the cold, and his hearing was not what it had been. The Lord's household was changing. New stewards, new preferences, and whispers of bringing in a cook from Copenhagen trained in the new French manner. In the morning, the castle would be exactly as it always had been. Walls standing, moat full, hearths smoking. The kitchen fires would light again before dawn, and someone else would stand where Mads had stood, shouting at scullions and scolding the bread boys. The soldiers would still want their ale hot in winter. The Lord would still want his meat pink in the centre, and the gulf between the two tables would remain as wide as the moat. That is the truth of the medieval cook's life in a Danish castle. It was not romance, not artistry for its own sake, and certainly not comfort. It was craft and cunning under pressure, a daily negotiation between scarcity and spectacle, fought with knives and ladles instead of swords. And when it ended quietly, not with applause, but with the steady knowledge that, for years, you had kept the walls standing and the hall feasting, and that in this world, that was as close to glory as the kitchen ever came. You know what really gets me? The medieval kitchen wasn't just a place to cook. It was basically a pressure cooker for bad economics, worse politics, and a kind of willful ignorance that makes you wonder how the whole system didn't collapse sooner. They'd hoard saffron like it was liquid gold, throw it into a lord's sauce so he could brag about it at dinner. But God forbid you save a pinch to keep the garrison from getting sick in winter. Nah, let the soldiers rot their teeth on stale rye, while the upstairs crew gnaws on candied almonds from Venice. And the waste. Oh man, the waste. Half the prestige. Food was about showing off, not feeding anyone. You roast a whole peacock, then wrap it back in its own feathers for presentation, only for some drunk noble to poke at it once and then shove it aside. Meanwhile, the kitchen boys are eating broth so thin you could read a letter through it. That's not hospitality, that's flexing. And here's the kicker. They had resources. We're talking fertile Danish soil, access to Baltic trade routes, whole coastlines full of fish, forests stuffed with game. But instead of making sure everyone in the castle was fed like a human being, they poured energy into making edible sculptures for rich people with zero self-awareness. This wasn't just bad ethics, it was bad logistics. Hungry soldiers are cranky soldiers, and cranky soldiers with weapons are a whole medieval HR nightmare waiting to happen. Now, if I'd been there, and yes, I know hindsight is the cheapest tool in history, I'd have flipped that pantry system on its head. First off, inventory rotation. You've got barrels of salted fish, cool cycle, the oldest stock to the garrison before it turns to shoe leather, and keep the freshest for feasts. You save food, and you keep morale. Second, dual menu prep, same core ingredients, two different executions. Venison stew upstairs, Great same pot base downstairs with more root veg. Stretch it to feed twice as many without doubling the work. Third, seasonal preservation teams. Use the summer glut to dry, pickle and smoke everything in sight. You'd be shocked how much food waste they tolerated just because no one wanted to spend an extra day brining cabbage. And maybe, just maybe, teach the nobles that their bragging rights could come from efficiency, not just excess. Imagine the social clout in saying, "My kitchen feeds every soul in my castle twice a day, all winter without famine." That's a flex I could respect. But no, in their heads, prestige was a table groaning under dishes. No one finished, while the people keeping the walls safe chewed on bones. If you strip away the candlelight and the banners, a lot of medieval castle kitchens weren't centres of culture. They were engines of inequality with a side of food poisoning. And yeah, I'm a little salty about it, probably more than their stew ever was.